Welcome back. In today's video, we're looking at the most terrifying animal attacks ever caught on camera, from a travel influencer dragged 90 feet in a lion's jaws to a travel vlogger who ventured one step too close to the edge of the Zambezi River and met the worst fate possible. It was August 29th, 2016. Along the Brooks River corridor in Alaska's Katmai region, late summer heat hung over shoulder-to-shoulder crowds lining the gravel bars as thousands of salmon surged upstream. Elevated platforms filled early, rangers repeated spacing reminders, and the constant churn of water and cameras masked how quickly a routine viewing day could tip past control. Dax Lorne was 26 and ran a small wildlife channel that focused on minimizing perceived animal danger. He worked part-time as a video editor and used most of his savings for trips designed to generate close-range wildlife footage. His earlier clips showed him near bison in Yellowstone and black bears in Montana, positioning proximity as controlled exposure rather than risk. Engagement had slowed over the past year. Katmai, known for high densities of coastal brown bears during salmon season, offered access to animals in open daylight along managed viewing areas. He was organized with equipment and travel logistics. He secured permits, reviewed park guidelines, and booked a guided day group along the Brooks River corridor. His filming style relied on narrowing the distance without triggering an obvious reaction. He had previously recorded bears that appeared indifferent to human presence when people remained inside designated zones, and he attempted to replicate that visual framing. The Brooks River ran shallow over rounded cobble, dense with sockeye salmon moving upstream, while multiple bears fished along established stretches of current. Coastal brown bears in Katmai commonly weigh between 700 and 1,200 pounds by late August. During hyperphagia, they feed for extended periods and may react abruptly if their fishing is interrupted at close range. A bear can cover 20 feet in roughly a second at short burst speed. In serious maulings, documented injuries frequently involve crushing trauma to the head, neck, and upper torso due to jaw strength and body mass, rather than prolonged predation behavior. That morning, Dax joined a ranger-led group and attended a mandatory safety briefing. The ranger emphasized maintaining distance, remaining within marked viewing boundaries, and never descending onto active gravel bars where bears were fishing. Visitors were instructed that bears focused on salmon should not be approached, even if they appeared calm. As the group continued downstream, Dax slowed and allowed distance to form between himself and the others. Across a narrow channel, a large bear stood mid-current, pinning salmon against submerged rocks. From the approved corridor distance, the bear continued fishing. Dax stepped off the marked area and descended the uneven bank, boots shifting in loose gravel. His camera remained raised. At approximately 30 feet, he tossed a small pebble toward the water. The bear paused, lifted its head, oriented toward the shoreline, and resumed fishing. He moved closer along the shoreline, reducing the gap to an estimated 20 to 25 feet. On the recovered footage, the bear's fishing rhythm changed. It lifted its head repeatedly and rotated its body angle toward shore. The interval between salmon strikes lengthened. Dax continued forward, still recording. The charge began abruptly. The bear dropped its head and surged from the shallows in a direct line. Gravel displaced under its forepaws. The distance closed in less than a second. Dax attempted to step backward while holding the phone. His right heel slid in unstable stones, and he fell onto his side. The bear collided with him chest first, knocking him flat. Its jaws closed over the right side of his head and upper neck. The recorded audio captured a heavy impact and scraping against rock. Witnesses across the river later described a single brief shout. The bear released and immediately re-engaged with a second bite directed to the back of the skull. Based on documented bear attack patterns, the force likely resulted from jaw compression combined with downward body weight rather than tearing. Movement from Dax became disorganized within seconds. The mauling remained brief. The bear stood over him and delivered additional downward bites to the cranial and upper cervical region. There was no prolonged feeding behavior. Blood spread rapidly across the gravel beneath his head. The active contact phase, from impact to disengagement, lasted under half a minute. The bear stepped away several feet, remained oriented toward the area briefly, then returned toward the river and resumed fishing within visible range. Emergency services were called immediately. Rangers staged with deterrent equipment and medical gear and waited until the bear had fully moved off before approaching. They reached Dax in approximately 12 minutes. On assessment, he had no pulse and was not breathing. Visible injuries included severe cranial trauma and extensive damage to the upper neck. Field responders documented depressed skull fractures and significant cervical instability. Resuscitation was not initiated due to injuries incompatible with survival. The medical examiner documented extensive skull fractures, catastrophic brain injury, and upper cervical spine disruption consistent with high-force blunt and bite trauma. The cause of death was listed as massive cranial and cervical trauma resulting from a bear mauling. Rangers recovered Dax's phone from the gravel near his right hand. The footage showed him crossing the viewing boundary, closing the distance, and the charge. The incident received limited regional coverage and was classified as a visitor distance fatality during peak salmon activity after a violation of designated viewing areas. The bear was not destroyed, consistent with policy for defensive encounters in food-focused contexts. Access to that corridor section was temporarily restricted. By evening, salmon continued upstream and bears remained along the same stretch. It was February 26, 2015, at the Wildlife Park in Oregon, where freezing rain coated the concrete walkways and cold wind pushed mist through the nearly empty zoo, while maintenance crews quietly moved animals between indoor holding areas before the afternoon crowds arrived. The whole place already felt wrong before anything even happened. Maren Salas was 52 years old and had driven several hours alone to visit the zoo during the anniversary week of a polar bear transfer she had followed online for years. Friends later described her as deeply attached to rescued wildlife, especially polar bears, and said she often traveled to parks and conservation centers to see specific animals in person. The bear she came to visit was a female polar bear named Sigrid, rescued as a cub years earlier near a remote northern Canadian shipping route after her mother disappeared. Maren became emotionally invested in the story and reportedly donated to wildlife programs connected to the bear. That morning, a handful of visitors noticed Maren spending an unusually long time near the polar bear habitat. The enclosure was built around a deep concrete basin with elevated fencing, steel barriers, and multiple restricted maintenance zones designed to keep visitors away from the habitat edge below. Adult polar bears can weigh over 900 pounds and are considered among the most dangerous land predators in the world, despite their calm appearance in captivity. Shortly before noon, security footage partially captured Maren leaving the public viewing platform and entering an employee-only perimeter corridor beside the enclosure. Investigators later confirmed she climbed over 2 restricted maintenance barriers before reaching a narrow service platform overlooking the habitat below. Because of the storm, the area was almost completely deserted at the time. Investigators later determined Maren had likely been drinking before arriving at the zoo. Responders found an open liquor bottle and prescription medication inside her vehicle after the attack, though officials never publicly disclosed the full toxicology findings. Witnesses earlier that morning described her behavior as emotional and erratic, with one visitor reporting that Maren appeared to be quietly speaking toward the enclosure while staring down at Sigrid near the pool below. Investigators believed Maren attempted to move farther along the restricted platform to get closer to the enclosure edge for photographs or a better view of the bear, but freezing rain had coated the metal grating and concrete surfaces with ice. Security footage later showed Maren slipping while climbing around the outer maintenance railing bordering the platform. She fell roughly 10 feet into the enclosure below. The few visitors still nearby immediately began shouting for help as Maren struck the sloped concrete near the pool, hard enough to visibly injure her leg and shoulder. Several people later reported hearing her cry out while attempting to drag herself backward toward the retaining wall. Sigrid reacted almost instantly. The polar bear charged across the enclosure from less than 30 feet away and reached Maren within seconds before she could stand, knocking her against the concrete near the waterline before dragging her several feet across the enclosure floor. Maren reportedly tried shielding her head while screaming for help as the bear bit repeatedly into her arm and upper torso. Zoo staff activated emergency alarms immediately, while visitors were evacuated from nearby viewing areas. Keepers attempted to distract Sigrid using compressed air deterrents and emergency noise devices, while veterinarians prepared tranquilizers, though specialists later confirmed sedation would not have worked quickly enough to stop an active attack already underway. The attack continued for nearly 2 minutes as responders struggled to reposition the bear long enough to safely isolate sections of the enclosure using hydraulic separation gates. By the time keepers redirected Sigrid into a secondary holding section, Maren had suffered catastrophic injuries, including massive blood loss, blunt force trauma, cervical fractures, and extensive tissue damage across her torso and arms. Paramedics entered the enclosure within minutes, but Maren was pronounced dead at the scene before transport could begin. The investigation later concluded the enclosure had functioned properly and that Maren's death resulted from unauthorized entry into multiple restricted areas during hazardous weather conditions. Wildlife specialists also confirmed Sigrid displayed normal predatory behavior throughout the attack and would not be euthanized following the incident. Footage from the incident was withheld by authorities for further investigations. It was April 3rd, 2013, along the northern shoreline of Lake Victoria near the Ugandan fishing settlement of Bukakata, and the water that morning sat flat and brown under a white sky, the kind of stillness that locals who had grown up on that lake knew better than to trust. Alexander Jar, 28, from Akron, Ohio, had built a modest but growing online following through what he called charity content, videos in which he handed cash, food, or clothing to visibly impoverished people across developing countries. His following grew modestly across YouTube and Facebook by early 2013, a number, climbing steadily as performative generosity attracted wider online audiences. Friends and collaborators described him as promotional by instinct, someone who treated every location as a backdrop and every interaction as footage. This trip to Uganda was his third to sub-Saharan Africa in 2 years. He had arranged through a Kampala-based NGO contact to document supply distributions to fishing families along the shoreline. He traveled with a single camera operator, a 24-year-old Ugandan freelancer named Amos Kibuka, who handled a second handheld unit. Their plan for April 3rd was to film Alexander distributing bags of rice, cooking oil, and children's clothing to Bukakata families before moving further south along the lake. Now, Lake Victoria's shoreline in this region is deceptively gentle. Low reeds, soft mud banks, and shallows that extend roughly 20 feet before dropping into darker, deeper channel. Nile crocodiles have inhabited these waters for millions of years, growing to 16 feet in length and exceeding 1,500 pounds at maturity. Their bite force registers above 5,000 pounds per square inch, the highest measured of any living animal. They are ambush hunters capable of remaining nearly motionless beneath the surface for extended periods, with only their eyes and nostrils visible. The strike, when it comes, moves from stillness to full contact in under a second. Several local fishermen present that morning later told investigators that a large male crocodile had been sighted repeatedly near the reed line closest to the distribution area during the preceding 2 weeks. One fisherman, identified in the police report only as Godfrey M., stated he had warned Alexander and Kibuka directly, pointing toward the waterline and speaking in Luganda. A second bystander confirmed the warning had also been communicated in broken English. According to multiple witnesses, Alexander acknowledged it with a nod but did not move back from the bank. The distribution had been underway for roughly 20 minutes when Alexander decided the framing needed adjustment. He told Kibuka he wanted the lake visible behind the children in the shot, then stepped shin-deep into the shallows, his footing shifting slightly in the soft mud as he angled his body toward the camera, his right arm hanging lower and closer to the waterline, holding his phone out to test the angle. Witnesses said he was looking at his screen, not the water. The crocodile struck within seconds of his entry. Apparently, what Kibuka saw was not the approach, but the immediate aftermath of contact. Alexander's right forearm disappeared into the water. The force of the initial bite rotated his upper body forward and sideways. The crocodile's rotational force carried through his arm during the first full roll before Alexander had time to vocalize. The death roll followed, without pause, a violent lateral rotation that multiple witnesses described as happening faster than they could process. The elbow joint gave during that first completed rotation, the ligament and bone structure failing under forces the joint was not built to resist. Alexander was dragged into deeper water within 4 seconds of initial contact. Kibuka ran to the water's edge but did not enter. Several fishermen struck the surface with oar handles from a distance. The water churned for closer to 12 seconds, the foam briefly turning red, then settled completely. Bags of rice and a sealed packet of children's clothing drifted outward from the point of entry. Kibuka called emergency services at approximately 9:14 a.m. The authorities arrived from Masaka 3 hours and 40 minutes later. Divers did not enter the water until a second team arrived the following morning. The body was recovered partially, approximately 590 feet from point of entry. Estimated time of death within 4 to 6 minutes of submersion. Alexander's remains were repatriated to Ohio 9 days later. His channel stayed active for several months before being quietly removed, with no official statement ever posted. The NGO contact issued a brief condolence statement, but made clear they had no involvement in the decision to film near the water. The fishermen of Bukakata did not speak extensively to outside media. In conversations with Ugandan journalists, several described Alexander's visits to their community as disruptive rather than generous, a man who arrived treating their poverty as production value and their warnings as background noise. The lake, they said, had simply done what it always did. It did not ask where a person had come from or what they had intended. It was June 14th, 2015, and the afternoon sun hung heavy over Chobe National Park in Botswana, turning the landscape into a shimmering expanse of golden grass and scattered acacia trees. The remote northern sector stretched for miles, a wilderness where tourist traffic was minimal. and wildlife moved with the confidence of creatures that rarely encountered humans. Temperatures hovered near 95 degrees, and the seasonal waterhole had become a critical gathering point for elephant herds. Marcus Holbrook adjusted his Canon camera lens, his fingers moving with practiced precision. At 42 years old, the Denver-based wildlife photographer had built a respectable reputation, capturing African wildlife. His wife Jennifer sat beside him in the Land Cruiser, reviewing the shots they'd captured that morning. The Holbrooks had arrived in Botswana 5 days earlier, their third trip to Africa in as many years. They were serious photographers who invested in top-tier equipment. Marcus specialized in elephant photography, fascinated by their complex social structures. Their guide was Kabo Motswana, a local who had been guiding tourists for 12 years. He'd developed a sixth sense for reading animal behavior and agreed to take the Holbrooks into the park's remote northern sector, where the elephants were less accustomed to vehicles. In the mid-afternoon, they spotted what Marcus had been hoping for: a herd of approximately 15 elephants gathered around a seasonal waterhole. The group included several young calves, but it was the matriarch that caught Marcus's attention. She was massive, easily identifiable by her broken right tusk. Marcus had his camera out before Kabo even brought the vehicle to a complete stop. He positioned his tripod outside the Land Cruiser's open side door. The park's regulations were clear. Visitors were supposed to remain inside their vehicles at all times, but enforcement in these remote areas was practically non-existent. The elephants appeared completely at ease. Then, just minutes into his recording, everything changed. One of the younger calves wandered away from its mother, moving toward the vehicle. It approached to within 20 feet of where Marcus stood. The matriarch noticed. Her ears flared outward. She raised her trunk high and released a trumpet call that echoed across the waterhole. Every other elephant in the herd froze. African elephants are the largest land animals on Earth, with adult females weighing between 6,000 and 7,000 pounds and standing up to 9 feet tall at the shoulder. But their size isn't what makes them dangerous. It's their intelligence and their fierce protective instincts. Elephant matriarchs will defend their family members with lethal force when necessary. They can run at speeds up to 25 miles per hour, despite their massive size, and a charging elephant generates enough momentum to flip vehicles, crush bones, and kill with a single strike. Kabo called out for Marcus to get inside. The matriarch was going to charge. Marcus hesitated. The matriarch was moving now, walking with heavy, deliberate steps directly toward them. He reached for his tripod, trying to collapse the extended legs, but the locking mechanisms were stiff. Jennifer had already scrambled back into the vehicle. The matriarch broke into a full charge, her ears pinned back, her trunk curled under her body, and her head lowered with her tusks pointing forward. Marcus dropped his tripod and dove toward the Land Cruiser's open door. His hands found the door frame just as Kabo threw the vehicle into reverse. Marcus was half inside, his legs still dangling outside, when the matriarch reached them. Her massive head struck the vehicle's side panel with the force of a wrecking ball. The entire Land Cruiser rocked violently. Marcus's grip on the doorframe was the only thing keeping him from being thrown out. The matriarch rammed again, this time catching the rear quarter panel. The impact left a deeply caved-in panel and shattered the rear window. Safety glass exploded inward. Kabo kept his foot pressed to the floor, but the Land Rover's reverse speed was limited, and the elephant was faster. The matriarch charged alongside the reversing vehicle. She swung her head sideways, and the impact knocked Marcus's grip loose. He fell from the vehicle, hitting the ground hard. Before he could even attempt to stand, the matriarch was on him. Her tusks came down with devastating force, goring through his chest. The massive elephant pressed her weight onto him, crushing his ribcage and vital organs. Marcus's body went still within seconds. Kabo slammed on the brakes. The matriarch stood over Marcus's body, trumpeting aggressively at the vehicle. Jennifer remained inside the Land Cruiser while Kabo physically blocked her from attempting to exit. Any movement toward the matriarch would likely result in another attack. Kabo radioed for emergency assistance while keeping the vehicle at a safe distance. The matriarch remained standing over Marcus's body for nearly 10 minutes before finally returning to her herd. The other elephants had remained in a defensive formation throughout the entire incident, protecting the calves while their matriarch dealt with the perceived threat. Park rangers arrived within the hour. They confirmed Marcus was dead at the scene. Massive chest trauma and internal injuries incompatible with life. Officials reviewed Marcus's recovered footage. The video clearly showed the Holbrooks operating their cameras outside the vehicle, a direct violation of park regulations. Jennifer was issued a citation but no fine, given the circumstances. The matriarch and her herd showed no unusual behavior afterward. Wildlife officials noted that she had simply done what any protective mother would do. The footage Marcus captured in his final moments was used in park safety training videos as a cautionary tale, but was never released to the public. Park officials determined that out of respect for Jennifer and the Holbrook family, the graphic nature of the attack should remain restricted to professional training contexts only. It was the evening of October 14, 2016, on the quiet forested outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, where pine trees pressed close against scattered cabins, and the air carried the damp chill of early autumn. The sun had slipped behind the ridgeline, casting amber streaks across the deck of a modest single-story home just off a gravel road. The property bordered a stretch of woodland known as a seasonal wildlife corridor. That week, residents exchanged messages about a grizzly bear repeatedly raiding unsecured trash bins, growing bold and familiar with the scent of human food. Inside the cabin lived Sandy Scraw, a 34-year-old freelance graphic designer who had moved to Montana only months earlier in search of quiet, cheaper rent and scenery that fit her small vlog channel. With roughly 4,000 subscribers, she filmed soft, slow-paced videos about cabin routines and remote living. She had no background in wildlife and no understanding of how quickly the forest behind her home could turn hostile. Her outdoor trash containers were plastic, lidless, and often overflowing with meat scraps. Grease from her stovetop drifted through the kitchen vent on the evening breeze toward the tree line. That night, she had set up her camera on a small tripod near the counter, filming a casual cooking segment as dusk settled in. The grizzly bear is the largest and most powerful land predator in North America, capable of weighing over 800 pounds and reaching speeds of 35 miles per hour in short bursts. Food-conditioned grizzlies, those that associate human dwellings with easy calories, are among the most dangerous animals a person can encounter. When strongly motivated by food, they may push into human structures, and typical residential barriers can fail quickly under force. The first sign came as a low scraping sound along the exterior wall. The camera continued recording as a massive shape appeared behind the sliding glass door. The grizzly lowered its head, pressing its snout to the frame, inhaling deeply. Then it rose, placing its weight against the glass. The wooden frame groaned but held for a moment. Sandy turned, frozen between the stove and counter, directly in line with the door and the scent pulling the animal forward. Without hesitation, the bear dropped its weight forward in a violent lunge. The glass shattered inward as the frame tore loose. The grizzly forced its head and shoulders through the opening, widening the gap with sheer mass. Sandy stepped back but hesitated, still positioned between the animal and the kitchen where the meat aromas were strongest. Her fatal mistake was remaining in that direct line, rather than retreating into a sealed interior room the moment the bear made contact with the door. As the grizzly pushed fully inside, the confined space and sudden proximity triggered a rapid, chaotic defensive reaction. A powerful forelimb swung in a short arc, striking her shoulder and upper chest with devastating force, claws opening deep lacerations and fracturing her collarbone. She was knocked sideways into the cabinets and collapsed onto the tile floor. In the same burst of movement, the bear's head dipped and snapped forward in a brief bite, clamping and releasing almost instantly. There was no clear sequence, only overlapping motion, driven by momentum, stress, and confusion. It continued forward, its weight crashing across her ribs as it forced through the narrow space. The camera was struck and knocked sideways, capturing only a blur of fur as the grizzly pushed deeper into the kitchen. By the time neighbors heard the commotion and contacted authorities, the bear was gone, slipping back into the tree line. Wildlife officials arrived within the hour, securing the scene and launching an investigation. Within days, teams located and euthanized the grizzly, confirming it was the same animal responsible for the trash raids that week. The community responded with shock and sorrow, neighbors leaving flowers along the gravel road, and online followers flooding her final videos with messages of grief. It was October 6, 2014, at a dusty roadside turnout outside Mysuru. Late afternoon heat pressed down on stalled tour vans and idling motorbikes as a small crowd gathered along the shoulder. The air hung thick and windless. In the tight strip between pavement and scrub, a minor misjudgment could turn a spectacle into an emergency. Nico Saran was 19 and traveling through southern India with two friends from university. He had deferred a semester in mechanical engineering and worked part-time in a warehouse to fund the trip. Among his friends, he had a habit of accepting dares once attention shifted toward him. Weeks before leaving home, He had been teased for backing out of a rooftop jump into a lake. During the trip, he had begun leaning into small public risks. He documented most of his travel: cliff dives, scooter rides, street food challenges. In daily life, he was structured and careful, but in performative settings, he pushed closer to boundaries. At the turnout that afternoon, when a roadside snake handler offered photographs for a small fee, Nico stepped forward first. The turnout bordered a narrow, two-lane road edged with scrub and scattered trees. Heat rose in visible waves from packed soil. The handler typically displayed Indian cobras, naja naja, and non-venomous rat snakes, species commonly used in informal roadside demonstrations in parts of southern India. There was no king cobra present. King cobras are rarely used in such settings due to size, cost, and handling risk. The cobra that afternoon measured approximately 5 feet in length, a typical adult size. Indian cobras are highly venomous elapids. Their venom contains neurotoxins that interfere with neuromuscular transmission, leading to progressive paralysis if untreated. When the handler lifted the cobra using a hook and guided it onto the ground, he remained slightly behind its head alignment, maintaining distance. The snake raised the front third of its body, hood expanding. At that height, the snake's effective forward strike distance was roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of its body length, approximately 1.5 to 2 feet. Nico initially stood about 3 feet away. He made small hand motions in front of the snake to provoke a higher hood display. The handler gestured for him to remain still and not lean closer. Traffic slowed along the road. Nico shifted forward at the waist to bring his face nearer the raised hood. Though his feet remained several feet back, his upper body entered within approximately 2 feet of the snake's head, inside realistic strike range. The cobra tracked the movement of his right hand as it passed through its field of vision. There was a brief stillness. The snake's head fixed. Nico's hand moved again. The strike was direct and linear. The cobra lunged forward in a fast extension driven by its anchored lower body. Its fangs contacted along Nico's upper lip near the left side, briefly holding contact before releasing. The contact lasted less than a second, typical of defensive cobra strikes. 2 puncture marks became visible almost immediately, accompanied by light bleeding. Nico recoiled and stumbled backward, dropping to one knee. The handler quickly repositioned the hook between the snake and the crowd and pulled the cobra away. The snake did not pursue. It lowered slightly and remained defensive, hood partially expanded, consistent with cobra behavior following a defensive bite. Nico pressed his fingers against his lip. Bleeding was modest. At first, he appeared more shocked than impaired. For the first 15 minutes, he remained alert and able to speak. Unlike viper bites, significant swelling was limited at the site. Around 30 minutes after the bite, early neurological symptoms began to emerge. His eyelids started to droop. His speech softened. He swallowed repeatedly and reported difficulty focusing. The handler urged immediate transport. A passing vehicle stopped within several minutes. Approximately 20 minutes after the bite, Nico was placed in the back seat. A call for emergency medical assistance was made while en route. During the drive, his symptoms progressed gradually. Ptosis became pronounced around 45 minutes post-envenomation. His speech slurred. He remained conscious but fatigued. By the time they reached a small rural medical facility, approximately 30 minutes after departure, he was struggling to keep his head upright. Basic airway support and oxygen were initiated. Indian cobra antivenom was not stocked on site, and mechanical ventilation capability was limited. Arrangements were made for urgent transfer to a larger hospital equipped for respiratory support. During the additional transfer, his breathing weakened significantly. Neurotoxic paralysis progressed to respiratory muscle failure about 90 minutes after the bite. Assisted ventilation was attempted during transport, but sustained mechanical support was not available until arrival. Despite resuscitative efforts, he was pronounced deceased shortly after reaching the higher-level facility. The medical summary listed the cause of death as respiratory failure secondary to neurotoxic envenomation from naja naja. The facial bite location, a highly vascular area, contributed to rapid systemic absorption. The roadside display was documented and discontinued, and the cobra was removed from public handling. Regional reports briefly noted a tourist fatality following a snake bite at an informal roadside demonstration. It was September 18, 2018, at a private wildlife park outside Durban, South Africa, where humid evening heat clung to crowded pathways, while security teams rushed across the carnivore section, responding to a perimeter disturbance near the restricted service corridors shortly before closing time. Jabari Ndlovu was 39 years old and had spent more than 12 years working inside the reserve's carnivore division. Other keepers trusted him because he stayed calm during dangerous situations and rarely lost control under pressure. Outside work, he volunteered during coastal coastal flood disasters and helped deliver emergency supplies to nearby townships after storms, and people like that usually become the person everyone depends on, not the other way around. Privately, though, Jabari's life had started falling apart. His marriage had collapsed over the previous year, and co-workers noticed he barely went home anymore. Most nights, he slept inside employee housing near the predator section, saying it made early rounds easier. But weeks before the incident, he picked up extra shifts, skipped meals, and volunteered for difficult animal transfers other keepers avoided. Staff later admitted he looked exhausted almost constantly, but nobody considered him reckless. If anything, they trusted him too much because he always seemed like the guy who could handle one more thing. That afternoon, reserve security reported a man climbing beyond the public barriers behind the lion complex. Jabari immediately responded alongside two security officers. The restricted service area sat behind concrete retaining walls and narrow keeper corridors connecting indoor dens to outdoor habitats. African lions can weigh over 400 pounds and move shockingly fast over short distances. The visitor was a 30-year-old former delivery driver named Themba Kosa, who had wandered into a restricted service walkway behind the lion habitat, while apparently trying to get a closer look around the reserve before closing time. Witnesses later described him as panicked and disoriented after realizing he had crossed into an employee-only area surrounded by drainage concrete and locked fencing. Security teams spent nearly 20 minutes guiding him back to safety before finally pulling him over the barrier with a harness. And during that time, most people probably thought the dangerous part was already over. But immediately afterward, reserve radio traffic became chaotic as security locked down nearby pathways and staff began containment checks around the lion section. During the confusion, Themba reportedly slipped away from the medical area and wandered through an improperly secured maintenance gate connected to the rear service corridor. Earlier that week, maintenance crews had reported problems with a hydraulic transfer gate near the lion section. The locking pin sometimes failed to fully seat unless manually checked, but repairs had been delayed. Security footage later showed Themba entering the narrow corridor alone, apparently believing the area was empty. But investigators later determined Zara, a 9-year-old lioness, had not yet been fully transferred into the secondary holding den, while staff completed remote containment checks after the earlier disturbance. Moments after Themba entered the corridor, the partially latched transfer gate shifted open just enough for Zara to force through. The lioness slammed him against the concrete wall hard enough to dent a steel storage cabinet beside the control panel. Zara bit into Themba's shoulder and upper chest, driving him to the floor inside the cramped corridor with nowhere to escape. Witnesses later described hearing repeated impacts against concrete as the lioness dragged and pinned him during violent bursts of movement. Jabari and armed response staff rushed toward the corridor after surveillance operators reported the attack over reserve radio. Staff activated compressed air deterrents while veterinarians prepared tranquilizers, though later reports confirmed sedation would not have acted fast enough during an active mauling. The attack continued for nearly 2 minutes before hydraulic pressure and noise finally forced Zara backward long enough for responders to secure the corridor and enter safely. Paramedics reached the corridor within 8 minutes and attempted stabilization before transporting Themba to a nearby hospital, where he died less than an hour later. Investigators later concluded the attack began after the visitor entered a restricted maintenance corridor during an active containment response. Jabari and other staff members were not blamed in this incident. It was July 14, 2017, and the Indian Ocean off Durban's North Beach was the color of wet concrete. By 8:40 a.m., Brecken Milo was already in the water with a camera crew on shore and a second operator waiting at the break. And within 40 minutes, the surf around him would carry a trail that had nothing to do with the shoot. Brecken was a 29-year-old content creator from Phoenix, Arizona. His content revolved around discipline, financial independence, physical fitness, and what he consistently branded as the architecture of a high-value life. He was not, by any serious measure, a surfer. He had picked it up 18 months earlier as a vehicle for visual content, something that translated well to slow-motion footage and wide coastal backdrops. His team traveled with him regularly, a primary cameraman, a secondary operator for closer angles, and an editor who also handled logistics. The Durban trip was structured around 4 days of beach and lifestyle footage to anchor a broader travel series. Durban's North Beach sits at the southern end of the KwaZulu-Natal coast, a stretch of shoreline that has recorded more shark attacks than almost any comparable region in the world. Bull sharks are the primary concern in these waters. They are not the largest shark species, but they are arguably the most dangerous in nearshore environments. Adults average between 7 and 11 feet in length and can weigh upward of 500 pounds. Their defining characteristic is tolerance for low salinity water, which allows them to penetrate river mouths, harbor channels, and murky coastal surf, exactly the conditions present that morning. Recent rainfall had pushed sediment runoff into the surf zone, cutting underwater visibility to under 3 feet, conditions that routinely elevate attack risk because sharks rely more heavily on pressure and silhouette detection when optical clarity is low. 2 lifeguards on duty made multiple passes along the waterline on foot and by whistle, directing the remaining surfers toward shore. Most complied. Milo's team requested 10 more minutes twice. The requests were denied, and the crew still remained in the water regardless, believing they can get their shots before authorities escalated. The lifeguards documented both exchanges. The water cleared the surfers by approximately 9:05 a.m., except for Milo, who was making a slow paddle run parallel to the break for a wide-angle pass. The shoreside cameraman was framing from a tripod position roughly 240 feet back. And then out of nowhere, Milo's board jolts forward and to the left. He does not fall immediately. The motion resembles a hard collision from below. The nose of the board lifts briefly, his torso drops toward the water, and he stabilizes with both hands gripping the rails. He holds that position for approximately 3 seconds. The operator said that he saw a dark mass passing beneath the surface just before impact, and a visible disturbance behind Milo's trailing leg. The bull shark apparently struck his upper right thigh. A single bite with immediate release, a pattern consistent with an investigatory or reflexive attack rather than sustained predation. The wound it left was not small. Milo attempted to paddle. This is visible to most eyewitnesses. He pushed himself upright on the board and began stroking toward shore with his arms, his lower body dragging low in the water rather than planing. Within seconds, a streak of red extended behind the board, spreading outward and diffusing quickly in the chop. The secondary operator was shouting toward shore, then toward the lifeguard tower. He did not enter deeper water. Witnesses on the beach later described Milo's paddle strokes as becoming asymmetrical quickly, the right side losing coordination before the left, his body listing within roughly 10 seconds of the strike. The bull shark's bite had torn through the lateral femoral region, severing the femoral artery and adjacent vessels. At the rate of hemorrhage, survivability without immediate tourniquet application was narrow. Lifeguards entered the water within approximately 1 minute of the secondary operator's shout. They reached Milo in under 4 minutes. By that point, he was face down alongside his board, tethered to it by the ankle leash, unresponsive. They turned him and began CPR in the shallows. Emergency services arrived at the beach at 9:21 a.m., 16 minutes after the initial strike. Milo was transported to Netcare St. Augustine's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. The cause of death was determined to be acute hemorrhagic shock resulting from a single shark bite to the upper right thigh. Partial footage of the attack was handed to investigators and was not publicly released. The secondary camera operator gave a formal statement and did not return to content work afterward. His family in Phoenix issued a brief statement requesting privacy. His mother, in a single comment to a local Arizona news outlet, said he had called home 2 days before the shoot and mentioned the ocean was rougher than he expected. She said he sounded fine. She said she wished someone had just made him come in. It was October 8th, 2016. And the morning air in South Luangwa National Park carried the crisp coolness that came just before the Zambian heat settled in for the day. The Mopane woodland stretched endlessly in every direction, prime leopard territory where experienced guides knew constant vigilance was required. Daniel Kowalski checked his rifle one final time, running through the safety protocols he'd performed hundreds of times before. At 31 years old, the professional safari guide had spent 7 years leading walking safaris through some of Africa's most dangerous terrain. That morning, Daniel was leading a group of 4 tourists, 2 couples, one from Germany and one from the United States. Werner Schmidt was filming continuously with a handheld camcorder. The group had been walking for over an hour when Daniel spotted fresh leopard tracks pressed into soft sand near a dry riverbed. Leopards were notoriously elusive, and sightings were rare enough to be considered the highlight of any trip. Daniel decided to follow the tracks, hoping to give his clients a glimpse from a safe distance. Werner's footage shows the group moving in single file. After some time, Daniel raised his hand in a stop signal. The camera zooms in, showing a male leopard well ahead, feeding on an impala carcass in tall grass. For a couple of minutes, the leopard fed, apparently unaware. Then it stopped, its head lifted, ears rotating forward. The leopard's eyes locked onto the group. Daniel instructed the group to back away slowly. The leopard stood, abandoned the carcass, and began walking toward them. Deliberate, purposeful steps. Its body language was tense, ears flat, tail twitching. Leopards are Africa's most adaptable big cats, weighing up to 200 pounds with bite forces strong enough to crush bone. Unlike lions, which sometimes use mock charges as warnings, leopards are more likely to either retreat completely or commit fully to an attack. especially when defending a fresh kill. When a leopard perceives a threat to its food source, its response can escalate to lethal violence in seconds. Within moments, the leopard charged. It broke into a full sprint, covering ground with explosive speed. Daniel fired toward the ground near the leopard, hoping to turn it. The leopard didn't stop. At a fresh kill, the gunshot only reinforced the leopard's perception of threat. At close range, Daniel fired again, aiming to wound. The shot went wide. The leopard launched itself at Daniel in a single leap. Werner's footage becomes chaotic. When the camera steadies, it shows Daniel on the ground with the leopard on top of him. The animal's jaws clamped onto Daniel's left shoulder, its rear claws raking his torso. Robert Chen, one of the tourists, ran forward with a hiking pole and struck the leopard. The animal released Daniel's shoulder momentarily and swiped at Robert. The leopard turned back to Daniel, its jaws clamping down on his throat. The bite was crushing, targeting the windpipe and major blood vessels. Daniel's body went limp beneath it. Werner's camera captures the leopard maintaining its grip for several more seconds before finally releasing him and sprinting back toward its kill. The entire attack lasted less than half a minute. The remaining tourists stood frozen, their training to remain still during wildlife encounters, overridden by what they'd just witnessed. Daniel lay motionless, his throat crushed, blood spreading across the ground. The leopard's bite had destroyed his airway and severed critical vessels. He lost consciousness within moments and died shortly after. Robert Chen, despite his attempt to help, was left with deep lacerations on his forearm from the leopard's defensive swipe, injuries that would require extensive treatment once they reached medical facilities. The tourists used Daniel's emergency beacon to radio for help. A rescue vehicle arrived within half an hour. Paramedics confirmed Daniel was dead at the scene. Authorities investigated using Werner's footage. Their analysis determined Daniel had followed all appropriate protocols, but had unknowingly approached too close to a leopard defending a fresh kill. The park classified it as defensive behavior. No action was taken against the leopard. Werner's footage was shared with safari guide training programs as a tragic example of how quickly leopard encounters can escalate. However, the most graphic portions showing the actual fatal bite and Daniel's final moments were edited out before any training use. Park officials and Daniel's employer agreed that while the footage had educational value, the full unedited version was too disturbing and would serve no additional purpose beyond what edited segments could provide. It was July 23, 2016, and the dry season had noticeably pulled Lake Victoria's shoreline back along Uganda's southeastern coast, exposing wide bands of mudflat. The receding shallows had concentrated crocodile activity along deeper channels and shoreline drop-offs, placing predators in the same waters where local fishing crews worked every day. Okello Wasaja, a 34-year-old commercial fisherman from a small landing site along the lake's northern shore, had spent the better part of 2 decades working these waters. Wasaja was a familiar presence at the landing site, known among other crews for his willingness to work stretches of shoreline that more cautious fishermen avoided during the dry months. He operated a weathered wooden boat with his longtime fishing partner, Kayondo Bizimungu, 40, a quiet, experienced net handler who had fished the same stretch since adolescence. The two men launched most mornings before sunrise, setting gill nets along the shallows where tilapia congregated during the dry months. The pair had launched before dawn that morning, motoring their boat to a familiar stretch of shoreline roughly 2 miles from the landing site. The sky was clear and the water flat, conditions that made the shallows appear deceptively calm. The area was known among local fishermen for reliable catches during the dry season, but also for an increase in crocodile sightings as water levels dropped. Villagers along this section of shore had reported at least 3 livestock taken from the water's edge in recent weeks, including a full-grown goat dragged from a drinking point in broad daylight. Despite the reports, fishing continued. The catches during low water were too valuable for most crews to abandon, and the economic pressure on families who depended on the lake left little room for caution. Wasaja and Bizimungu set their nets in the shallows and returned to deeper water to wait. When they motored back to check the nets later that morning, Wasaja stepped over the side of the boat into waist-deep water to begin hauling the nets by hand, a standard practice along the lake. Bizimungu remained in the boat, managing the lines. Wasaja had his phone sealed inside a small waterproof pouch clipped to the front of his shirt, a habit he had maintained for years to protect the device from spray. Bizimungu later told investigators that Wasaja had been recording a short video of the morning's catch moments before stepping into the water to haul the nets, and had not stopped the recording before entering. Nile crocodiles are among the largest and most dangerous reptilian predators on Earth, with exceptionally large males males capable of exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,600 pounds. They possess one of the most powerful bite forces of any living animal, generating pressures exceeding 3,700 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone and sever limbs. Their attack strategy relies on concealment and explosive ambush, launching from beneath murky water with enough force to drag large mammals off riverbanks. Once the initial bite secures the victim, the crocodile initiates a death roll, a violent spinning maneuver designed to disorient prey before dragging it beneath the surface to drown. In the shallow, sediment-heavy waters of Lake Victoria during the dry season, a crocodile can rest motionless within feet of a wading human without being detected. According to testimony gathered by regional wildlife officers and local marine police, the crocodile struck while Wasaja was standing in approximately 3 feet of water, his hands occupied with the tangled gill net. Bizimungu reported that the water erupted without warning directly in front of his partner. The crocodile's jaws clamped around Wasaja's midsection, the force of the strike pulling him off his feet and beneath the surface almost instantly. Bizimungu described churning water, a spray of mud, and then a sudden drag toward deeper water as the crocodile initiated the death roll. The violent turbulence moved outward from the boat, the disturbance shifting direction as the animal pulled its grip beneath the surface. Bizimungu attempted to reach his partner with an oar, standing in the boat and driving it downward into the churning water, but the disturbance was already moving beyond his reach. Within seconds, the water began to settle. Wasaja did not resurface. Bizimungu motored back to the landing site and alerted authorities. Local marine police units and wildlife officers reached the area within hours. Wasaja's body was recovered the following day from a submerged embankment roughly 100 yards from the attack site, consistent with crocodile caching behavior. The waterproof pouch containing his phone was still attached to his clothing. Investigators extracted a brief segment of heavily obscured footage and distorted audio from the device. The visual portion consisted largely of muddy water and violent motion blur, with no clear image of the animal. The device was taken into possession by wildlife officers and local police as part of the ongoing inquiry. The footage was not released publicly at the family's request. Nile crocodile attacks account for dozens to possibly hundreds of fatalities annually across sub-Saharan Africa, though exact figures remain unreliable due to widespread underreporting. It was June 15, 2015. In a fenced pedestrian viewing area outside Rapid City, dry summer wind moved across open prairie as visitors leaned against steel rails designed to separate foot traffic from the wide grass beyond. One man stepped over the boundary, leaving packed gravel for uneven ground, and the empty stretch ahead suddenly became dangerously exposed. Bram Kellen was 32, a warehouse shift lead from a northeastern Wyoming town. He managed inventory teams overnight and spent his weekends driving to state parks and roadside attractions to clear his head. After a recent breakup, co-workers noticed a change. He had begun filming small dares, climbing restricted structures, standing closer than advised to wildlife, posting short clips with captions about being built different. He was not reckless in daily life. He showed up on time, trained new hires, and kept detailed spreadsheets. But outside work, the risks were growing. A privately operated wildlife park outside Rapid City had been on his list for months. The drive-through loop allowed close vehicle views of elk and bison, and a separate fenced walk-through zone offered a safer vantage point. Bram told a friend he wanted better footage than the usual car window shots. He arrived late morning, paid for entry, and spent nearly an hour along the pedestrian rail watching grazing animals across the interior setback. Beyond the fence, the rolling grassland sloped gently toward a solitary mature bull bison. Adult bulls can exceed 6 feet at the shoulder and weigh over 1,800 pounds, with short curved horns and a heavy skull shielded by thick bone and muscle. Despite their size, they can accelerate to 30 miles per hour in short bursts and pivot quickly. Their flight zone varies, but direct approach inside approximately 20 to 30 feet often triggers defensive behavior. Raised tail, lowered head, pawing or short ground strikes are established warning signals. Unlike cattle, they do not tolerate close human pressure on open ground and may charge when escape space feels limited. Signage along the rail stated that crossing barriers could result in serious injury or death, and that bison can outrun humans over short distances. Visitors had earlier been verbally reminded by staff to remain behind the primary fence. When Bram began joking that they were just cows with better publicity, several people near him told him to step back from the rail. The bull lifted its head once, oriented briefly toward him, then resumed grazing while maintaining awareness. Without further hesitation, Bram climbed over the pedestrian barrier and dropped into the restricted interior setback. The drop was about 3 feet onto open grass. Several visitors shouted for him to return. Bram walked across the open field, closing the distance from roughly 25 yards to under 15 in less than half a minute. At approximately 25 feet, he clapped and shouted. The bull's posture changed immediately. Its head lowered slightly. The shoulders rolled forward. One forehoof struck the ground in a short, forceful stomp. The tail rose stiffly. These signals are widely documented as pre-charge indicators. Bram stepped closer again, reducing the distance to roughly 15 feet. Arms raised. The charge began abruptly. From that range, the bull covered the distance in under 2 seconds. The impact was blunt and forceful, as the animal's frontal boss and horn base struck Bram in the lower torso and upper thigh. The upward momentum lifted him partially off the ground and threw him backward several feet. He landed on his back. Before he could regain footing, the bull followed through. Rather than repeatedly goring, which is less common in brief defensive encounters, the animal's horn caught beneath his lower rib margin during the forward surge, tearing clothing and penetrating the lower chest wall. The animal's mass carried across him. One forehoof struck across his abdomen as it stepped through, and a hind hoof clipped his pelvis during the stride. The entire contact sequence lasted only a few seconds before the bull continued past him. Bram attempted to inhale. His mouth opened, but no coherent speech followed. Blood appeared at his lips, consistent with internal thoracic injury. The bull moved several yards away and stopped, facing outward but no longer engaging. A bystander ran toward the pedestrian exit and alerted on-site personnel. A call for emergency services was placed within approximately 1 minute of impact. Staff entered the perimeter in utility vehicles, using engine noise and positioning to increase distance between the bull and the injured man without provoking further agitation. They reached Bram in roughly 4 minutes. He was unresponsive. A carotid pulse was faint and then absent. Basic life support was initiated, including chest compressions and attempts to control visible bleeding. Given the severity of internal trauma, survival likelihood was already low at this stage. Emergency medical responders arrived approximately 12 to 15 minutes after dispatch, consistent with rural response intervals. Advanced airway placement and intravenous access were attempted. Ventilation was difficult due to suspected bilateral lung injury and chest wall instability. He was pronounced deceased shortly thereafter. The coroner listed the cause of death as blunt force and penetrating trauma to the chest and abdomen due to bison impact and trampling. Injuries included multiple rib fractures, pulmonary contusions with likely lung puncture, liver laceration, significant internal hemorrhage, and thoracic compression, consistent with a high-mass ungulate strike. A single penetrating wound was attributed to incidental horn contact during forward momentum rather than repeated goring. Cardiac arrest occurred within minutes of injury. The pedestrian viewing zone is closed temporarily. A secondary setback barrier was later extended to increase the separation distance between visitors and large ungulates. Updated signage emphasized reaction speed and minimum safe distances. The bull remained in the habitat, and the incident was classified as a defensive response to a human breach of space. Local coverage was brief, focusing on barrier violation and wildlife safety. No action was taken against the bison, as the behavior aligned with established defensive patterns. It was June 11, 2017, at a marine park in San Diego, where seawater mist drifted across the empty stadium before sunrise, while trainers prepared the main performance pool for a private promotional event scheduled hours before the park opened to the public. Lena Park was 34 years old and had spent years trying to build a career around travel videos, tourism campaigns, and resort partnerships. Sponsors liked her because she always looked polished, stayed professional, and somehow made every place feel luxurious on camera. But behind all of that, friends said she's burnt out and stressed about views dropping, worried about losing sponsors, and always chasing the next post that might finally keep her career going. The Marine Park campaign ended up being one of the largest contracts Lena had booked in months. According to people close to her, she needed it badly. In the weeks leading up to the shoot, she barely slept between editing sessions, airport layovers, and sponsored uploads. Staff later said she arrived carrying backup cameras, multiple outfits, portable lighting gear, and enough filming ideas to stretch the trip into several sponsored posts across different platforms. The stadium pool sat beneath gray coastal skies with seawater mist drifting over the concrete platforms before sunrise. Orcas are among the most intelligent marine predators on Earth, capable of recognizing routines, objects, and repeated behaviors from trainers and handlers. Adult males can weigh over 9,000 pounds and generate enormous force even during normal movement. Staff at the facility had repeatedly documented one male orca named Coda displaying fixation behavior around loose objects in the water, especially floating fabric, hoses, and dangling equipment during enrichment sessions. But most of these incidents ended harmlessly, so it was never divulged to the public and did not make the local news. Before filming began, began, production crews held a safety briefing, reminding everyone to secure loose clothing and keep a safe distance from the waterline. Lena initially tied back her hair and changed into fitted wardrobe pieces approved by the park. But during camera tests, one marketing coordinator reportedly suggested loosening her hair because it looked more natural on video. Nobody corrected it afterward. The shoot itself was supposed to stay entirely platform-based. Direct in-water interaction between performers and orcas had already been heavily restricted at the facility for years, following multiple safety reforms across the industry. Lena's role was simple. She would kneel near the edge of the platform, while Coda surfaced nearby during controlled photo passes, directed by trainers from a protected position farther back. Filming began shortly after sunrise. As cameras rolled, strands of Lena's loose hair and part of her lightweight overshirt drifted close to the waterline, while Coda surfaced beside the platform. Security footage later showed the orca briefly mouthing the floating fabric near her side. One trainer immediately issued a release command while another signaled Lena to stay still, but Lena instinctively pulled backward the moment she felt tension against her clothing. Investigators later believed that sudden movement may have intensified Coda's fixation response. The orca submerged while still gripping part of the fabric, yanking Lena off the platform hard enough for her head to strike the concrete edge before she fell into the water. Emergency alarms activated instantly as trainers began recall procedures from the platform. Underwater cameras later showed Coda circling tightly around Lena beneath the surface, while responders attempted to redirect him using trained signals and acoustic cues. Later, marine behavior reviews avoided describing the incident as a deliberate attack. Instead, specialists concluded the whale likely remained fixated on the moving fabric and chaotic movement inside the water. Witnesses saw Lena resurface briefly multiple times before being forced back under by Coda's movement through the pool. Staff deployed floating barriers and distraction equipment, while emergency responders rushed toward the medical access platforms nearby. Lena managed to grab part of the deck before another sudden movement pulled her away again. The struggle lasted over a minute before responders finally separated Coda long enough to retrieve her from the water. Lifeguards pulled Lena onto the medical platform unconscious with severe bruising across her torso, scalp lacerations, and compression injuries around her neck and shoulder. Paramedics arrived within minutes and continued CPR during transport to a nearby trauma center, but Lena was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The coroner later listed drowning, cervical trauma, and prolonged forced submersion as the primary causes of death. The marine park suspended all promotional animal shoots within days. Internal investigations later revealed repeated safety shortcuts involving private influencer events and inconsistent enforcement of appearance restrictions near active animal platforms. Coda was not euthanized because behavioral specialists concluded the incident aligned with previously documented object fixation behavior patterns rather than predatory aggression. Footage from the incident was soon deleted due to its high graphic content. It was September 14, 2015, and the sky above Denali National Park hung low and colorless, the kind of overcast that flattens shadows and makes distances hard to judge. A morning that offered no warmth and no warning before it became the last Soren Falk would ever see. Soren was 29, from Asheville, North Carolina, and had built a following of 4,000 subscribers over 3 years. Her content was built around what she called spiritual rewilding, barefoot hiking, extended fasting in remote terrain, and long monologues about humanity's disconnection from the natural world. She rejected conventional outdoor safety protocols openly and often, framing bear spray and guided access as products of collective fear, rather than practical necessity. Her comment sections were full of people who found her approach liberating. Her family, by most accounts, had quietly stopped watching. The Alaska trip had been announced to her audience 2 weeks prior. She described it as a pilgrimage to witness the late salmon run in what she called the last honest wilderness in America. She had filmed 3 videos in the days before the incident, each pushing closer to active bear feeding areas along a tributary of the Teclanica River. The Teclanica drainage in mid-September is a compressed corridor of urgency. Grizzlies feed with brutal efficiency during the salmon run, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day to build fat reserves before denning. Adult females with cubs are the most unpredictable animals in North American wilderness. A sow grizzly weighs between 250 and 450 pounds, runs at 35 miles per hour, and delivers a bite force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch. When protecting cubs, they do not bluff. Park rangers at a visitor center had issued a formal advisory 3 days earlier, warning hikers of elevated elevated bear activity along the Teclanica corridor and recommending groups of 3 or more, accessible bear spray, and a minimum 300-foot buffer from any bear with cubs. A separate hiker, Dara Wolf, 34, from Missoula, Montana, encountered her that same evening at a backcountry campsite. She later told investigators Soren carried no bear spray, no canister, and stated plainly that bears respond to the energy a person brings into their space. On the morning of September 14th, Dara was positioned roughly 240 feet upstream on elevated ground, using a 400mm zoom lens to photograph the river. She observed Soren crouch near the bank approximately 60 feet from a sow and her 2 cubs feeding on a salmon carcass. She had her camera raised. According to Wolf's statement, the sow raised her head within seconds, ears forward, body rigid. There was no bluff charge. She accelerated immediately, covering the 60-foot distance in just over 1 second. The impact knocked Soren onto her back. Wolf said that she the sow mounting Soren immediately, driving her face first into the gravel with her forelimbs. The first bite was delivered to the upper back of the skull, a crushing, sustained grip. Her arms moved briefly, fingers opening and closing against the riverbank gravel. The sow released and regripped twice within the first 15 seconds, targeting the neck and base of the skull each time. The bear's cubs remained 15 feet behind their mother. The sow's behavior throughout was focused and methodical. She pinned, bit, shook, and pinned again. Soren's movements ceased entirely within approximately 55 seconds of initial contact. The sow gripped her upper torso and dragged her roughly 8 feet off the trail before releasing and standing over the body. When Wolf and 2 other hikers who had heard her shouting began advancing and shouting, the sow moved her cubs back up the riverbank. Wolf used her satellite communicator to contact park dispatch at 9:47 a.m. Rangers reached the location at 11:20 a.m., 1 hour and 33 minutes after the attack. Soren died en route to the hospital. Coroner said that she sustained multiple crushing fractures to the occipital and parietal regions of the skull, consistent with large carnivore bite force. Severe soft tissue destruction to the posterior neck and upper cervical spine. Cause of death listed as craniocerebral trauma with secondary cervical cord transection. Time of death estimated within 2 minutes of initial contact. Rescue teams noted the absence of bear spray and any protective gear, finding only her camera bag crushed under a fallen log. Investigators marked the scene as a textbook example of predictable predator behavior, and in her online communities, her death became a grim punchline. Thousands of comments blaming bad vibes and woo-woo energy for a death that could have been prevented with basic preparation. Her online accounts were taken down later at the request of her family. Denali Rangers used the incident to push for revised backcountry permit requirements in high-activity corridors, a proposal stalled in review for 4 years. It was April 3, 2018, and the Namibian sun was already climbing toward its midday peak over Etosha National Park. The air shimmered with heat across the open plains, where scattered acacia trees provided the only shade for miles. Temperatures were pushing toward 100 degrees, and the dry season had left the landscape parched and dusty. Sophie Laurent adjusted the camera mounted on her chest harness. At 26 years old, the conservation volunteer from Lyon, France, had spent the past 4 months working with a small wildlife trust in Etosha, documenting black rhino populations. Black rhinos were critically endangered, with fewer than 5,500 remaining in the wild. That morning, Sophie was working with Dr. Peter Van Rooyen and Malcolm Hughes, a wildlife photographer. Their target was a female black rhino nicknamed Kaya, Swahili for home, who had recently given birth to her second calf. Malcolm was filming with a professional-grade video camera. The team approached in a modified Land Rover, staying inside the vehicle as per strict park protocols. They parked a good distance from where Kaya and her calf were resting beneath an acacia tree. Malcolm's footage shows Kaya lying on her side, the calf nursing. After several minutes of observation, Kaya stood abruptly, her ears rotated forward, nostrils flaring. The calf scrambled to its feet. What happened next was unexpected. Sophie's door, which she had left slightly ajar for better air circulation, swung fully open. A strong gust of wind caught it, and the door banged against the vehicle's side panel with a sharp metallic clang. Kaya reacted instantly. She lowered her head, horn pointing forward, and charged toward the sound. Dr. Van Rooyen called out for Sophie to close the door and told their driver, Johannes Amukoshi, to drive. Johannes started the engine and began accelerating, but the Land Rover was slow to build speed on the soft sand. Black rhinos are among the most dangerous animals in Africa, capable of weighing up to 3,000 pounds. Despite their massive bulk, they can run at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour, faster than most humans can sprint. Their horn can gore and kill with devastating efficiency. When protecting their young, black rhino mothers become living weapons. Though their eyesight is poor, they charge aggressively toward any perceived threat, using sound and movement to guide them. Sophie lunged for her door, trying to pull it shut, but the wind resistance made it difficult. The door swung partially closed, then banged open again. Sophie was leaning out, both hands gripping the door handle. Kaya reached the vehicle in seconds. Her horn struck the open door with tremendous force, tearing it partially free. Sophie, still gripping the handle, was pulled halfway out of the moving vehicle. Malcolm's camera shows Sophie dangling from the Land Rover's side. Dr. Van Rooyen grabbed her arms, trying to pull her back in. Johannes accelerated harder, the vehicle bouncing violently. The damaged door continued to bang and swing, creating more noise and movement. Kaya charged again at the moving vehicle, her massive bulk slamming into the side. The impact caught Sophie's exposed body, and the force knocked her completely free. She hit the ground hard. Kaya stood her ground nearby, snorting aggressively, her calf safely positioned behind her. The rhino's behavior was textbook maternal defense. She made no attempt to pursue the vehicle further, instead positioning herself between her calf and the perceived danger. Dr. Van Rooyen called out from the vehicle as he watched Sophie's motionless form on the ground, knowing they couldn't approach while Kaya remained in defensive posture. Malcolm's camera captured the moment as Johannes slammed on the brakes. Dr. Van Rooyen reached for the emergency radio. Even from the vehicle, the severity of Sophie's injuries was apparent. The team was forced to wait, unable to provide any medical assistance while the protective mother rhino stood guard. Kaya remained in the area for several minutes, preventing any approach. Only when satisfied did she slowly back away, guiding her calf toward the acacia tree. Johannes carefully maneuvered closer. Dr. Van Rooyen and Malcolm rushed to Sophie's side. She was unconscious, barely breathing, with massive trauma to her torso. Blood pooled rapidly beneath her. Dr. Van Rooyen applied pressure and attempted CPR, but the internal damage was too severe. Sophie died at the scene before the medical helicopter could arrive. The cause of death was massive internal trauma and hemorrhaging. Etosha National Park officials reviewed Malcolm's footage. Their report concluded that the door malfunction created an unpredictable situation that triggered Kaya's protective instincts. The charge was classified as defensive maternal behavior. No action was taken against Kaya. Park protocols were updated to require all vehicle doors to be secured with safety straps during rhino observations. The footage from both Malcolm's camera and Sophie's chest-mounted camera was retained by Namibian wildlife authorities for their official investigation. After the investigation concluded, the footage was sealed and never released publicly. Officials cited the ongoing need to protect the identities and privacy of conservation workers in the field, noting that releasing such graphic content could discourage future volunteers from participating in critical endangered species research. It was April 8, 2014, and the Sundarbans mangrove forest along Bangladesh's southern coast had entered the peak honey harvesting season. Permitted crews of Mawalis ventured deep into a landscape where Bengal tigers had preyed on humans for centuries. Rafiqul Malla, a 47-year-old Mawali from a village on the forest's northern fringe, had collected honey in the Sundarbans for over 25 years. Malla had learned the trade from his father, who had worked the same tidal channels before him, and was regarded among his peers as one of the most skilled collectors in the district. He knew the forest's shifting tidal patterns, the location of productive hive clusters across seasons, and the warning signs that preceded tiger encounters. He was among the most experienced members of his crew, a group of 7 men who entered the forest under a seasonal permit issued by the Regional Forest Authority. The crew traveled by wooden boat along the narrow tidal channels, stopping at known collection sites and working in pairs or small groups to locate and harvest hives. The Forest Authority had recorded an increase in tiger encounters that season, attributing the trend to shifting activity patterns in the Western Range. Malla's crew had been briefed on the elevated risk and instructed to maintain group cohesion at all times. Each man carried rudimentary protective equipment, including a clay mask worn on the back of the head, based on a traditional belief that tigers are less likely to attack prey that appears to be facing them. On the day of the incident, Malla's crew had anchored near a dense stand of giwa trees approximately 3 hours into the forest by boat. The tide was low, exposing slick mud banks along the channel edges and narrowing the navigable waterway to a corridor barely wide enough for the boat. The air was heavy and still, thick with humidity and the smell of tidal decay. The crew split into smaller groups to work adjacent collection sites. Malla moved ahead of his nearest partner to inspect a hive he had spotted in the upper canopy of a tree roughly 50 yards from the water's edge. His partner remained at the previous collection point. Malla carried a basic feature phone in his shirt pocket. He had been using it intermittently throughout the morning to record short voice notes about hive locations, a habit his crew members later confirmed, and investigators believe the device was still in an active recording state when he approached the final tree. Bengal tigers are the apex predator of the Sundarbans ecosystem, uniquely adapted to hunting in tidal mangrove terrain. Adult males weigh between 400 and 500 pounds, with females females averaging 250 to 350 pounds. Tigers in the Sundarbans have developed specialized hunting behaviors distinct from their counterparts in grassland or dry forest habitats, including swimming between islands, stalking through waist-deep water, and attacking from dense root systems where visibility is measured in feet rather than yards. Their ambush strategy relies on approaching from behind, closing to within a single leap before striking. The killing bite targets the back of the neck or throat, crushing the windpipe or, in rare cases, damaging the cervical spine. The Sundarbans tiger population is responsible for a historically significant number of human fatalities, though modern annual fatality figures have declined significantly compared to historical averages due to reduced forest access and increased monitoring. Based on the crew's subsequent testimony and the Forest Authority's examination of the site, Malla had moved beyond visual contact with his nearest crew member when the attack occurred. His partner reported hearing a sudden, sharp crash through the undergrowth, followed by a brief vocalization that was cut short almost immediately. Then silence. The crew shouted Mullah's name repeatedly and received no response. When they converged on his last known position, they found deep impressions in the soft mud where something heavy had struck the ground, drag marks leading into the root system, and Mullah's harvesting tools scattered at the base of the tree. The drag trail continued for some distance before disappearing into a flooded channel where the mud gave way to standing water. The crew did not follow. Mullah's phone was recovered from the mud near the collection site. Data extraction revealed a fragmented recording left running during his approach to the hive. The audio captured ambient forest sounds, then a sudden eruption of noise, heavy impact through vegetation, brief chaotic disturbance, and then silence. The device was recovered face down in the mud, and a few seconds of distorted visual footage near the end of the recording showed only motion blur and ground before cutting out. A response team from the Forest Authority, accompanied by armed wildlife guards, entered the area within hours. Mullah's remains were recovered approximately 200 yards from the collection site, partially concealed in dense undergrowth. The condition of the remains was consistent with a large predator kill. The authority confiscated the phone and all recovered materials, retaining them as part of ongoing efforts to determine whether the attack was part of a pattern. The footage and audio were not released publicly. It was September 3, 2017. The Zambezi River had dropped to its dry season lows, exposing wide sandbars baked hard under afternoon heat. Tourist vehicles idled near the waterline while phones recorded the still, shimmering surface. Within seconds, the quiet stop unraveled, leaving a live stream running in the sand as chaos replaced the calm. Juno Marek was 24, a low-level live streamer from Brno who supported himself through remote tech support work while traveling on a tight budget. When viewership dipped, he gravitated toward controlled risks, cliffs, traffic, wildlife, placing himself close to danger to create tension. He was methodical in most areas of life. He tracked metrics obsessively and planned locations carefully. This safari stop was another calculated setting. The exposed sandbar, pale and sun-bleached, offered open space with the river channel behind it, visually dramatic, but environmentally unstable. The Zambezi lay low under a cloudless sky, its main channel narrowed by the dry season. Sandbanks widened as water levels dropped, forcing wildlife into tighter corridors between deep channels and feeding areas. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large mammals in Africa. Adult males commonly weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds and can reach speeds of up to 19 to 20 miles per hour over short distances on land. Despite their size, their jaws can open approximately 150 degrees, with lower canines typically measuring 12 to 20 inches, used for combat rather than feeding. They are not predators, but they are intensely territorial in water and highly defensive when their access between land and deep water is obstructed. Most serious incidents occur when a person unknowingly stands between a hippo and its primary escape route to deeper water. Before anyone stepped off the vehicles, the lead guide instructed guests to remain within a marked perimeter near the trucks. He explained that hippos were active in the main channel and that dry season sandbars were often part of their established movement routes. Disembark time was limited. Most guests stayed close. Juno walked farther onto the sandbar. A large hippo was partially submerged nearby, only the eyes, ears, and a portion of its back visible. The animal was positioned in shallow water between the sandbar and the deeper channel. From a behavioral standpoint, Juno had moved directly into the hippo's line of retreat toward deep water. A guide called out and motioned for him to return. He continued forward. When he closed to approximately 12 to 15 feet, the hippo reacted. The response was immediate. The animal pivoted in the shallows, pushing off with its hind legs. A hippo's acceleration over the first several yards is extremely rapid, often covering short distances in under 2 seconds. Juno turned late, attempting to run across soft sand. The hippo reached him in a forward surge. Its jaws opened as it made contact. The upper jaw struck across his lower chest, while the lower tusks rose into the left side of his abdomen. The impact was blunt and forceful. Witnesses later described a heavy concussive sound rather than a tearing noise. The force knocked him off balance. Hippos do not perform the spinning death roll associated with crocodilians. Instead, they bite, lift, and shake laterally. The animal clamped briefly and lifted, then executed a powerful upward and sideways head motion. This displacement action fractured multiple ribs and drove a lower canine deep into the abdominal cavity, causing massive internal trauma. Blood appeared immediately at the puncture site. The hippo was released after the initial lift. Juno fell onto his right side. He attempted to push himself upright but showed uncoordinated movement consistent with rapid blood loss and severe internal injury. Witnesses described shallow, irregular breathing and visible bleeding into the sand. The hippo remained oriented toward him at the water's edge, mouth partially open, ears rotating. When two guides moved several steps forward, the animal shifted again, lowering its head and stepping ahead in a renewed threat posture. They stopped. A second charge at that distance was highly plausible given the defensive context. The group maintained space until the hippo re-entered deeper water. Emergency protocol was initiated immediately. Due to the remote riverside location, response required vehicle transport from a nearby operations base and coordination with a downstream support boat. A medically trained responder arrived roughly 30 minutes later. Juno had no detectable pulse and no spontaneous respiration on assessment. A medical summary listed the cause of death as catastrophic internal hemorrhage from blunt force crush injury and penetrating trauma consistent with a large herbivorous mammal bite. Findings included multiple rib fractures, a lacerated liver, abdominal perforation, and rapid blood loss. There was no evidence of repeated mauling. Injuries aligned with a single defensive bite and forceful head displacement. A brief public statement confirmed the guest had moved beyond designated safety boundaries despite instructions. Coverage remained limited and framed as a wildlife safety reminder. No criminal charges were filed. Personal belongings were recovered from the sandbar. The site showed compressed sand, blood pooling, and a short drag impression. The river returned to stillness within minutes. It was April 3, 2015, at the Riverside City Zoo in Louisiana, where heavy humidity hung over the crowded reptile house, while stagnant water reflected dim overhead lights across concrete enclosures packed with weekend visitors escaping the afternoon heat. Children pressed against fogged viewing glass as the smell of algae, whetstone, and standing water drifted through the building. Tommy Aguilar was 27 years old and had traveled to the city with two friends for a short weekend trip after recently bouncing between construction jobs across Texas and Louisiana. Friends called him Tox because he joked constantly and could make strangers laugh within minutes. But the truth is, Tommy's life had been falling apart for years. I found reports about drug arrests, disappearing for days at a time, and relationships with family members completely breaking down. At some point, people around him seemed to stop asking if he was okay because they already knew things probably weren't getting better. Earlier that afternoon, Tommy and several other visitors spent hours drinking near the riverfront before entering the zoo shortly before closing time. Witnesses later said Tommy became increasingly detached as the day went on, laughing to himself, staring into exhibits too long, and repeatedly insisting some of the animals looked fake. Toxicology later found methamphetamine, alcohol, and dissociative drugs in his system. The reptile section sat beneath heavy humidity and the smell of stagnant water drifting through shaded concrete walkways. Saltwater crocodiles can remain motionless for hours while monitoring movement around them, which is honestly part of what makes them dangerous. People start mistaking stillness for safety. Security footage later showed Tommy standing at the viewing rail for nearly a minute, staring at Oscar, a 14-foot crocodile lying partly beside the basin. Several nearby visitors heard Tommy laughing quietly while tossing small gravel pieces toward the animal's tail. Oscar never reacted. Somehow, that became enough for Tommy to convince himself the crocodile wasn't real. The enclosure used a decorative outer railing, a landscape divider, and a second containment fence around the actual habitat. Months earlier, staff had already discussed modifying parts of the barrier because some sections were easy to climb. But the changes were delayed after administrators argued nobody had ever tried entering the enclosure before. Now this really frustrates me. Tommy climbed over the first barrier, Visitors immediately started yelling for him to stop, while others ran for zoo staff. Even two adults trying to grab Tommy as he crossed the landscaping area, but he pulled away and climbed the secondary fence before anyone could stop him. According to some witness accounts, several people were yelling at Tommy to come back while one zoo employee activated an emergency radio call from the walkway. But Tommy just ignored everyone and dropped nearly 8 feet into the enclosure perimeter. Video footage later showed him crouching beside Oscar and placing one hand against the crocodile's armored back, preparing to sit on it. When the Oscar did not move, he swung one leg partly across the crocodile's body, and that was when Oscar exploded sideways. Witnesses later described hearing a loud cracking sound when the crocodile's jaws clamped across Tommy's chest and shoulder. Tommy screamed and clawed at the concrete, while Oscar dragged him toward the basin. Several visitors started throwing bottles, shoes, and nearby objects into the enclosure, while others screamed for staff to help. One man even tried climbing over the outer barrier before security officers pulled him back. Oscar submerged almost immediately while maintaining his grip. Cell phone footage later captured violent turbulence as the crocodile rolled underwater. Zoo staff rushed in within seconds, carrying catch poles and compressed air deterrents, while handlers worked to isolate the animal using submerged partition gates. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, but responders could not safely enter the basin until Oscar was secured behind the hydraulic barrier system. Tommy was pronounced dead at the scene after recovery teams pulled him from the water. The coroner later documented drowning, catastrophic crush injuries, cervical fractures, and severe blood loss caused by repeated rotational trauma underwater. Investigators later concluded the enclosure itself technically functioned properly, but earlier recommendations involving climb deterrents and visitor barriers had never been fully implemented. The cell phone footage was then removed and kept by authorities. It was September 4th, 2017, and the Luangwa River moved slow and brown through South Luangwa National Park, Zambia, the kind of afternoon that felt deceptively still before something irreversible happened. Billy Briggs, 34, had spent 3 years building a Facebook following of nearly 2,000 people on a premise that was simple: no editing, no filters, no delay. He went live from places that travel shows sanitized and encouraged his audience to do the same. Based out of Portland, Oregon, Billy had no formal background in journalism or wildlife. He had worked restaurant management before a solo trip to Iceland in 2014 became the start for him. From there, he leaned into it fully. His content spanned Southeast Asia, Central America, and most recently Sub-Saharan Africa. His reputation among collaborators was of someone perpetually calculating the next angle. Fellow creators who had worked with him described him as genuinely curious, but difficult to redirect once he had decided on something. For this Zambia trip, Billy had specifically booked a multi-day boat excursion along the Luangwa River, a carefully chosen route he planned to showcase live for his followers, featuring hippos, what he described in a pre-trip post as perhaps the most underrated and dangerously deceptive animals in all of Africa. What Billy approached as a variable for his broadcast, a chance to create suspense and increase engagement with his audience, was understood quite differently by the other passengers and the boat crew. To them, it represented a compounding risk, a constant reminder that these massive territorial creatures were unpredictable, capable of rapid bursts of speed, and far more lethal than any camera lens could safely capture. The Luangwa in September is reduced to a series of warm, shallow pools connected by sluggish channels, its banks compressed by the dry season, until animals have little choice but to share the same water. Hippopotamus amphibius, common hippos, are the third largest land mammal on Earth, with mature males exceeding 3,000 pounds and capable of running 19 miles per hour on land. In water, they are faster and nearly silent. Their canine tusks can exceed 20 inches, and their jaws exert a force estimated above 1,800 pounds per square inch. Despite being herbivores, hippos are responsible for more human fatalities in Africa than any large land predator. Territorial males are acutely responsive to perceived intrusion, particularly during dry season when resources compress and stress among dominant animals runs high. The boat operator, a man named Evident Fury, who had guided the Luangwa for 11 years, had briefed the group that morning. Keep voices down, remain seated, hold a minimum 130-foot distance from any pod. A second commercial boat carrying 6 tourists from a separate lodge traveled the same stretch, positioned roughly 295 feet behind Billy's vessel. Fury had already repositioned the boat twice in the previous 20 minutes. Once when Billy stood to get a wider frame. Once when he began narrating loudly toward the animals. On both occasions, Fury told him directly to sit and lower his voice. Billy acknowledged him both times and complied briefly before returning to the bow. Fury cut the engine to drift closer at Billy's request, citing better light with the afternoon sun behind the pod. This action directly violated commercial wildlife safety regulations, which prohibit approaching within 130 feet of a dominant male, hippo, and would be noted in the formal review. The dominant male had been stationary for several minutes at roughly 100 feet. Then it surfaced again, 40 feet from the bow, closer than Fury had anticipated. Billy leaned forward over the railing, phone extended outward and slightly downward toward the water. The hippo did not vocalize before it moved. Witnesses on the second boat later described it as a sudden displacement of water, a large V-shaped wake that appeared and closed the gap in under 2 seconds. The animal simply rose. The jaws closed across Billy's lower torso as he leaned over the railing. The force was sufficient to lift him partially off the deck before the animal pulled downward and sideways. The lateral thrashing motion, a behavior hippos use to tear and disorient, was clearly visible to all 6 passengers on the second vessel. Fury screamed at his passengers to get down and reverse the engine at full throttle. The live stream continued for approximately 9 seconds after initial contact. The audio captured shouting, a loud impact, and then water rushing over the microphone before the non-waterproof device sank irrecoverably. Fury radioed for emergency assistance at 4:17 p.m. The nearest park ranger station was 14 miles away by water. Due to the shallow channels and low water levels, the current slowed travel. Help arrived at approximately 5:40 p.m. Billy's body was recovered from a shallow bank 1,800 feet downstream at 6:55 p.m. The coroner's report described bilateral crush injuries to the pelvis and lower abdomen consistent with large animal bite force, transection of the descending colon, and catastrophic damage to the lumbar spine. Cause of death was determined as hemorrhagic shock secondary to traumatic evisceration. Time of death was estimated within 4 minutes of initial contact. Fury was cleared of negligence following a formal review, though the inquiry noted the minimum safety distance had been violated at the time of the incident. His license was suspended 60 days pending procedural review. Billy's family in Portland released a brief statement asking for privacy. Several of his brand partners quietly removed his content from their promotional pages within the week. It was August 22nd, 2017, and the morning heat was already building along the Rufiji River in Tanzania's Salusi Game Reserve. The air hung thick over the muddy riverbanks, where brown water moved sluggishly between dense vegetation. This section was remote, nearly 18 miles from the nearest ranger station, and known for its high concentration of Nile crocodiles. Andrew Peterson checked his camera equipment one final time. At 34 years old, the adventure travel vlogger from Melbourne, Australia, had built a YouTube channel called Extreme Encounters with over 400,000 subscribers. His tagline read, "Getting closer than anyone else dares." Andrew had arrived in Tanzania 3 days earlier, requesting access to the most dangerous crocodile spots. His local guide, Emmanuel Kitwana, had been reluctant, but the money Andrew offered was substantial. After making Andrew sign liability waivers, Emmanuel agreed. That morning, they positioned themselves on a muddy riverbank. Andrew had set up multiple cameras, a handheld GoPro, a tripod-mounted DSLR, and a waterproof camera on an extendable pole. The recovered footage shows Andrew crouched at the river's edge, explaining how Nile crocodiles could grow up to 20 feet long and weigh over a ton. Emmanuel could be heard off camera, asking Andrew to step back. Andrew waved him off. Within minutes, Andrew extended his GoPro on a selfie stick out over the water. His feet were now less than 3 feet from the water's edge, positioned on slippery mud. The riverbank sloped gently downward into shallow water. Nile crocodiles are among Africa's most dangerous predators, perfectly adapted for ambush hunting. They can remain motionless for hours, submerged with only their eyes and nostrils above water. When they attack, they explode from the water with shocking speed. Their bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch. They kill by drowning their victims, using a violent spinning motion called a death roll. What happened next occurred in seconds. A massive Nile crocodile, later estimated at 14 feet, lunged from the shallow water. The crocodile's jaws clamped onto Andrew's right leg just below the knee. The DSLR recorded everything. Andrew being dragged toward the water, Emmanuel sprinting toward him. The crocodile began pulling him toward deeper water. Emmanuel reached him within seconds and grabbed both arms, pulling with all his strength. The struggle lasted only moments. Blood streamed from Andrew's mangled leg, turning the water dark red. The crocodile was stronger. With a violent twist, it wrenched Andrew from Emmanuel's grip. The crocodile dragged him into deeper water. The DSLR footage shows the horrifying moment, the crocodile beginning its death roll, Andrew's body spinning violently. Emmanuel stood at the water's edge, but entering the water would mean certain death. Emmanuel continued calling out, even as the thrashing in the water became less violent. Emmanuel later told investigators that standing there, knowing there was absolutely nothing he could do without becoming a victim himself, was the hardest part. The thrashing continued for nearly half a minute before the water went still. Andrew had disappeared beneath the surface. Emmanuel immediately radioed for emergency assistance. He remained at the riverbank, watching the murky water for any sign of movement, though the outcome was already certain. A rescue team arrived within the hour. Divers equipped with protective gear entered the water later that afternoon. They recovered Andrew's body downstream, in deep water. Andrew had died from drowning and massive trauma. The crocodile's death roll had caused catastrophic injuries. Medical examiners determined he had likely lost consciousness quickly. Officials issued a statement emphasizing that Andrew had violated multiple safety protocols. No action was taken against the crocodile. Emmanuel Kitwana was cleared of any wrongdoing after the video footage confirmed he had repeatedly warned Andrew. Emmanuel later stated that Andrew had wanted the perfect shot. The crocodile was just being a crocodile. Andrew was being foolish. The footage was used in wildlife safety training programs, but Andrew's YouTube channel and all associated social media accounts were permanently deleted by his family within weeks of his death. His family released a statement asking that the footage never be made public, stating that Andrew's reckless pursuit of viral content had cost him his life, and they did not want his death to inspire similar behavior in other content creators. Tanzanian authorities honored this request, and the footage remains restricted to professional safety training contexts only. It was September 14th, 2015, and the first autumn chill had settled across Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. Salmon runs were nearing their peak along remote tributaries, drawing enormous concentrations of brown bears to the waterways for their annual feeding frenzy. Timofey Grushenko, a 44-year-old freelance wildlife photographer from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, had spent the previous 6 years documenting Kamchatka's bear population across its remote river systems. Grushenko was a quiet, methodical man whose colleagues described him as deeply committed to his work, but increasingly willing to take risks to capture the images that had so far eluded commercial success. He worked alone by preference, a practice that concerned those who knew him, but that he maintained was essential to avoiding the disturbance that larger groups created around feeding bears. His trips were self-funded and conducted on minimal budgets, often involving solo camps lasting a week or more in areas with no reliable communication. Grushenko had established a campsite along a tributary roughly 30 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a combination of off-road vehicle and foot travel. The site was positioned approximately 200 yards from a shallow gravel bar where bears congregated to catch spawning salmon. The stream ran cold and fast over loose gravel, and the surrounding forest was dense with alder and willow that limited visibility in every direction. Bear trails were worn deep into the soft ground along both banks, some of them passing within yards of where Grushenko had pitched his tent. Grushenko's equipment included a professional-grade camera with a telephoto lens, a tripod, and a handheld video camera he used for supplementary footage. He carried bear spray, but no firearm. Brown bears are among the most powerful terrestrial predators in the Northern Hemisphere, with adult males on the Kamchatka Peninsula regularly exceeding 800 pounds and occasionally surpassing 1,000 pounds during peak autumn feeding. Despite their enormous size, brown bears can sprint at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour over short distances. Their claws, measuring up to 4 inches, can cause devastating wounds with a single swipe, while their bite force exceeds 1,200 pounds per square inch. During the period of hyperphagia, when bears consume up to 90 pounds of food per day to build fat reserves for winter dormancy, they are focused primarily on feeding and typically avoid humans. However, surprise encounters at close range, particularly near active feeding sites or cached food, can trigger a defensive response of extreme violence. Most fatal brown bear encounters are defensive rather than predatory, involving bears that are startled, protecting cubs, or defending a food source. According to the investigation conducted by regional law enforcement and wildlife officers, Grushenko had not been heard from for approximately 5 days when a resupply contact reported him overdue. His family, alarmed by the silence, organized a search effort through a local outfitter who chartered a helicopter. The search party, consisting of local guides and wildlife rangers, reached the campsite within a day of launching. The camp showed signs of a sudden, violent disturbance. The tent had been partially collapsed and torn. Equipment was scattered across a wide radius, and investigators identified bear tracks and biological evidence consistent with a large male. The bear spray canister was found intact and unused near the tent's entrance, suggesting the encounter had unfolded too quickly for Grushenko to deploy it. Scene evidence and the pattern of damage suggested that a bear had entered the campsite at close range, likely attracted by food odors or the salmon processing occurring nearby along the stream. The tent fabric showed large claw tears consistent with bear damage, and the ground around the tent entrance was deeply gouged where something had been dragged. Investigators determined that the encounter was most consistent with a surprise defensive reaction, a bear startled at close proximity, responding with immediate aggression rather than a deliberate, predatory approach. Grushenko's remains were recovered in a fragmented state approximately 100 yards from the camp. The remains had been subsequently fed upon and partially covered with forest debris, behavior sometimes observed even in encounters that begin as defensive. His camera equipment was recovered at the campsite. The primary camera had sustained significant water and impact damage, likely from being knocked into the stream bed during the disturbance. Police reviewed the recovered memory cards but found no footage of the attack itself. The fragments that were recoverable appeared to be from filming sessions in the days prior, with the final recoverable frames showing the campsite and surrounding stream. Regional law enforcement retained all recovered files as part of the fatality investigation. The family declined requests to authorize any further release. It was July 21st, 2018. At an unsealed river crossing along a remote work corridor in Australia's Northern Territory, dry season heat pressed down on cracked mud and slow, opaque water. Warning signs stood faded at the bank's edge. Within seconds, the stillness broke. The shallows erupted into violent movement, and a single boot remained beside the track. Kai Danton was 22, on a working holiday visa, rotating through seasonal fencing and road crews in remote areas of Australia's tropical north. He was physically capable and generally reliable, known for taking on heavier posts and volunteering for overtime in the heat. In the weeks before the incident, co-workers said he had begun pushing back against teasing about being overly careful at a previous job. He accepted minor dares and leaned into risks that were visible and measurable. The pattern was not constant recklessness. It was situational, and it showed up most when others were watching. That morning, the crew had been grading a stretch of dirt track that dipped through a shallow river. Kai rode in the second truck. He had been steady with equipment and followed instructions. The stop at the crossing was routine, meant to check depth and debris before driving through. Multiple metal signs on both approaches warned of crocodiles and prohibited swimming or approaching wildlife. Kai stepped down with the others, hands on hips, scanning the bank. The river was low and slow under dry season heat, with cracked mud along the edge and a faint green sheen where water met silt. Saltwater crocodiles in northern Australia commonly exceed 13 to 16 feet, with large males capable of weighing over 1,500 pounds. In hot weather, they gape to regulate body temperature, holding their jaws open while fully alert. They can surge forward from a resting position for roughly half their body length on land, powered by hind legs and tail. Their bite force is sufficient to fracture forearm bones, and once prey is in water, they may perform short rotational rolls to destabilize and reposition their grip. A large male lay angled toward the waterline, jaws open, eyes partially closed but not asleep. Most of the crew stayed near the trucks. Kai walked closer, stopping at an estimated 6 to 8 feet from the animal's head, well within potential lunge range. A co-worker told him to step back. Kai picked up a thin branch from the bank. He stepped forward again and extended the branch toward the lower jaw. The stick made contact near the front teeth. The crocodile's body stiffened and drove forward in a rapid burst lasting less than 2 seconds. Its jaws closed over Kai's left forearm. The force pulled him off balance immediately. The branch fell. The crocodile did not release. Kai tried to brace with his right hand, but the mud gave way beneath his boots. The crocodile pivoted and pulled backward in a single, sustained drag rather than repeated thrashing. At the water's edge, buoyancy increased its leverage. Kai's knees struck the shallows, then his torso. His trapped forearm remained clamped in the jaws as he was drawn chest deep. In shallow water, the crocodile executed one brief roll, submerging both bodies within seconds. From strike to full submersion, the struggle lasted only moments. The surface rippled, then went still. Crew members retreated and called for help. Responders arrived after a rural delay, and entry was postponed until the animal moved off. Kai's body was recovered downstream later that day. Injuries included crushing fractures to the left forearm and evidence of drowning following rapid submersion. Rib findings did not suggest prolonged rolling, indicating quick incapacitation. The death was classified as a workplace river crossing fatality. Procedures were revised to prohibit approaching visible crocodiles and to require in-vehicle depth checks. It was November 14, 2017, at a privately operated wildlife park outside Johor Bahru, Malaysia, where humid afternoon air hung over crowded concrete walkways, while children's music, tour announcements, and overlapping birthday celebrations echoed through the Predator Amphitheater during a packed holiday weekend. Daniel Varga was 41 years old and had spent nearly 2 months traveling across Southeast Asia, filming wildlife parks and tourist attractions for a small travel blog he ran back in Hungary. He wasn't a huge creator or anything, but he took the blog seriously enough to spend most of his savings chasing unusual experiences he hoped would finally grow his audience. Friends later said he had a habit of getting a little too comfortable around animals. Daniel specifically visited the park for the tiger performance after seeing videos online showing handlers standing just feet away from full-grown Bengal tigers. But what really stands out in this case is knowing that Daniel spent most of the afternoon near the front row, filming constantly and asking staff how close visitors could get after the show. He was clearly very focused on getting closer to the tigers, and I found it surprising that nobody stepped in or treated that behavior as a warning sign before things escalated. One of the park's biggest attractions was a male Bengal tiger named Malik. He weighed over 580 pounds and had spent most of his life around crowds, loudspeakers, flashing cameras, and live shows. But according to the handler's notes, Malik had always reacted badly to sudden loud metallic noises or chaotic crowd energy. Things like speaker feedback or crashing equipment had triggered pacing and aggressive lunges before. Veterinarians had reportedly warned the park several times to reduce overstimulating environments around Malik's performances, but management never made major changes because nobody had been seriously hurt before. The covered amphitheater trapped heat and amplified noise from the crowd. Even trained tigers still react on instinct when startled, which honestly makes live predator shows feel way more fragile than they look from the audience seats. That afternoon, the arena was packed because several school groups and tour buses had arrived at the same time. Near the end of the show, production crews behind the seating section started moving a portable lighting rig used earlier for promotional filming. According to investigators, one of the wheel locks on the portable lighting rig slipped after rolling over wet concrete near a spilled drink stand. Witnesses said the entire structure suddenly tipped sideways into a metal crowd barrier before crashing straight into stacked speakers beside the seating area. The noise was apparently brutal. Metal slammed into concrete, speakers screeched with feedback, and the sound echoed across the covered arena hard enough to make people physically jump in their seats. Malik reacts immediately, and right as the crowd started panicking, Daniel reportedly moved closer toward the front railing, still trying to film the tiger through the confusion. Investigators later believed that sudden movement near the edge of the arena probably made Malik even more reactive in that moment. The tiger flattened his ears, dropped low to the ground, and lunged toward the front perimeter before handlers could fully redirect him. Witnesses described Daniel stumbling backward after partially losing balance near the low front barrier, as Malik slammed against the service gap separating the performance zone from the audience edge. The tiger managed to hook Daniel with one forelimb and pull him partially into the restricted perimeter area before handlers triggered emergency lockdown procedures. Malik immediately clamped onto Daniel's shoulder and upper torso before dragging him several feet across the concrete floor. Families ran toward exits while handlers screamed evacuation commands. Cell phone footage later captured pieces of the chaos, children crying, adults stumbling over seats, and Daniel desperately trying to shield his neck while Malik repeatedly repositioned his grip. When emergency alarms were activated, nearby handlers triggered remote slide gates and deployed compressed air deterrents from behind a secondary barrier. Malik briefly released Daniel once before lunging again as more screaming erupted from the crowd. Witnesses later described hearing low growls, people screaming, and Daniel gasping between the impacts against the concrete. And for me, that's probably the hardest part of this case, because it means he was still conscious through part of the attack. The mauling continued for over a minute before hydraulic barriers and repeated deterrent blasts finally forced Malik backward toward the holding corridor. Responders rushed in the moment the secondary gates sealed behind the tiger. Paramedics reached Daniel within minutes, but he died during surgery less than 2 hours later. Investigators later concluded the attack was triggered by a sudden loud noise inside an already overstimulating arena environment, combined with crowd panic near the performance area. The wildlife park permanently suspended all live predator performances within 2 days. Camera footage was kept away from public eye in respect to Daniel's family. It was October 14, 2016, and the outer perimeter of Sentara Bush Lodge in Savo West, Kenya, had gone quiet the way bush does when something large is near. The kind of dark past the fence line where acacia scrub becomes a wall, and the things moving through it with confidence are the things that own it. Dario Venn, 29, had built his Instagram account on a single illusion: that he lived closer to danger than his audience ever would. Born in Thessaloniki and raised in Montreal, he held a communications degree and had worked as a marketing associate before staged wilderness photography outpaced his salary. His feed was meticulous: ropes he didn't need, fires built for the frame, water droplets applied to a lens before the shot. Friends said that he was skilled at it, and a full sponsorship from an outdoor gear brand was funding the Kenya trip entirely. The sponsored stay at Centaura was designed to produce a week of content. Dario had been there 4 days shooting everything from sunrise to golden hour. But a friend he was messaging beforehand said that Dario wanted something his audience hadn't seen yet. His phone's notes app, recovered later, contained draft captions referencing a planned nighttime shoot, unfiltered, off-grid language his followers expected at regular intervals. Tsavo West covers roughly 3,500 square miles of thornbush and volcanic rock. Its lions are distinct, maneless or lightly maned males, harder to spot in low light, ambush hunters capable of bursts near 40 miles per hour. Adult males average between 350 and 420 pounds, and their killing method is precise: gripping the neck and head, collapsing the airway through bite pressure rather than a specific PSI measurement. 2 males had been circling the lodge perimeter on both previous nights, and the lodge had logged both sightings. The head ranger had addressed guests at dinner on October 13th, telling everyone to remain inside the fence after dark. Dario was at the table. A senior staff member spoke to him directly the following afternoon, after overhearing him describe the nighttime plan to another guest. The warning was not subtle. Staff instructed the security team to actively monitor him and escort him back inside if he approached the fence again. That same evening, a guard on the northern fence section saw Dario near the barrier around 11:20 p.m. and told him to go back inside. Dario turned and walked toward the main lodge. 20 minutes later, the guard heard the fence being climbed 60 feet south of his post, outside his sight line. According to later investigations, at around 11:40 p.m., Dario cleared the perimeter carrying a tripod and a mirrorless camera fitted with a remote shutter trigger set to interval shooting every 5 seconds. Recovered footage showed him setting up approximately 30 feet outside the barrier, adjusting the angle to place the lodge lights in the background. He knelt in front of the lens, and the camera began firing frames. Authorities said that the camera captured 17 images over the following 90 seconds. In frame 14, a shape appears at the lower left edge of the frame. Frames 15 and 16 show it in motion. Frame 17 is blur. The night guard reported hearing a single cut-off sound at approximately 11:43 p.m. Not a scream, something shorter, the sound of air leaving a body without warning. He radioed it in immediately. A second guard reached the fence within 4 minutes and swept the area with a handheld floodlight. The tripod was still standing. The camera was still running. Drag marks in the dry soil led north into the scrub roughly 90 feet. A ranger with a vehicle and spotlight arrived 11 minutes after the initial radio call. The lion, an adult male estimated at 390 pounds, was crouched over Dario's body at the edge of a dry drainage channel, jaws still gripping the neck. Feeding had begun immediately at the upper torso. A warning shot forced it to move a few yards back, but remain nearby. The abdomen had already been opened, and feeding had begun. It was already clear to all present that Dario could not have survived. The body was motionless under the lion. Blood on the soil and torn clothing confirmed trauma consistent with fatal predation, and the immediate feeding indicated that death had occurred within seconds. Staff radios and eyewitness reports circulated the grim confirmation before any formal medical examination. The coroner's summary detailed that the cause of death was asphyxiation and cervical trauma secondary to large feline predation, trachea crushed at the 3rd and 4th cartilage rings. No evidence of sustained physical struggle. Estimated time from contact to loss of consciousness was under 30 seconds. Significant post-mortem abdominal trauma, consistent with feeding behavior. Dario's sponsoring brand issued a brief statement of condolences and quietly removed his tagged content from their feed within 48 hours. His personal account stayed active for a week. His last post, a golden hour image of the lodge fence line, captioned the boundary between comfort and real life, kept collecting comments from followers who did not yet know he was dead. His collaborators took down his channel later. The Kenyan Wildlife Service reviewed the lodge's perimeter protocols and required additional lighting and motion sensors along the fence line. After a confirmed human fatality, authorities ordered the lion destroyed due to public safety concerns rather than relocation. The camera and tripod were returned to Dario's family. According to family representatives, the footage has not been viewed since and was never released to the public. It was November 12, 2019, and the early morning mist was just beginning to lift over the Sabi River in Kruger National Park. The water moved slowly through this section, creating shallow pools and muddy banks where hippos gathered during the day. The temperature was already climbing, promising another scorching day in the South African bush. Michael Chen and his girlfriend, Lisa Park, were on a guided walking safari, one of the park's premium experiences that allowed tourists to explore on foot with armed rangers. Their guide was Dumisani Mthembu, a ranger with 15 years of experience navigating Kruger's most dangerous areas. The group of 6 tourists had been walking for about an hour when they approached a bend in the river. Dumisani raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. Through the morning haze, they could see a large hippo resting in the shallows about 50 yards away. Michael pulled out his phone and began recording. The hippo appeared calm, half submerged in the muddy water, seemingly unbothered by their presence. Dumisani explained in a low voice that they would give the hippo a wide berth, circling around through the bush to maintain a safe distance. Hippos were responsible for more human deaths in Africa than any other large animal, he reminded them. Despite their docile appearance, they were extremely territorial and could run at speeds up to 30 miles per hour on land. The group began moving in a wide arc, staying in single file behind Dumisani. Michael continued filming, capturing the hippo as it remained motionless in the water. Then Lisa stumbled. Her foot caught on a root and she fell forward, her backpack hitting the ground with a loud thud. The hippo's head snapped up, its ears rotated forward. For a moment, everything was still. Dumisani instructed the group to remain absolutely still. The hippo was already rising from the water. Its massive body emerged, revealing its true size, over 3,000 pounds of muscle and aggression. Hippos possess enormous jaws that can open to nearly 180 degrees, with canine teeth that can grow up to 20 inches long. Their bite force exceeds 1,800 pounds per square inch, powerful enough to bite a crocodile in half. The hippo began moving toward them, not running yet, but walking with purpose, water streaming off its gray hide. Dumisani positioned himself between the group and the approaching hippo, his rifle ready. The hippo's body language shifted suddenly. Its ears pinned back, and it broke into a full charge, its short legs moving with surprising speed, its mouth opening wide to display massive tusks. The charge was too fast. Dumisani raised his rifle but didn't have time for a clear shot before the hippo was on them. Dumisani fired into the ground directly in front of the charging animal and called out for the group to run for the trees, but the hippo was already committed. The group scattered. Michael's phone footage becomes shaky as he ran, but the audio captures the chaos. The sounds of people running, Dumisani calling out directions, and the thunderous sound of the hippo's charge. Lisa was still recovering from her fall, slower than the others. She ran in the wrong direction, toward open ground instead of the tree line. The hippo, targeting the closest moving figure, pursued her. Michael's camera swung around just in time to capture the moment. The hippo caught Lisa from behind, its massive jaws clamping down on her torso. The bite was catastrophic. The hippo's teeth penetrated deep, crushing ribs and vital organs. The hippo shook its head violently, the way a dog shakes a toy, then threw her aside. She landed several feet away, motionless. Michael called out Lisa's name as he stumbled, another tourist grabbing him before he could run toward her. The other members of the group had reached the tree line and were calling for Michael to keep moving to safety. Dumisani fired multiple shots into the air and at the ground near the hippo. The animal bellowed, turned, and charged back toward the river, crashing through the shallows before disappearing into deeper water. The ranger immediately positioned himself between the tourists and Lisa's body, scanning the area for any sign the hippo might return while simultaneously assessing whether there was any chance of survival. Dumisani ran to Lisa. The hippo's bite had caused massive trauma. She had died almost instantly. Dumisani radioed for emergency evacuation while keeping watch on the river. The hippo remained in the deeper water, visible only as a dark shape beneath the surface. A helicopter arrived within 40 minutes. Lisa's body was airlifted out along with the traumatized group. Officials reviewed Michael's footage. Their investigation determined that Lisa's fall had triggered the hippo's territorial response, and her subsequent movement in the wrong direction made her the most accessible target. The attack was classified as defensive behavior typical of hippos when they perceive a threat near their water source. The hippo was monitored by park rangers, but no action was taken to remove it from the area. Park officials used the incident to reinforce safety protocols for walking safaris, emphasizing the unpredictable nature of hippo encounters and the importance of maintaining distance from water sources. Michael's footage was submitted as evidence during the investigation, but Kruger National Park officials made the decision to keep it permanently sealed. The footage was deemed too graphic for any public or training purpose, and officials stated that existing educational materials on hippo behavior were sufficient. The decision was also made out of consideration for Lisa's family, who requested that no images or video of her final moments ever be released. South African authorities granted this request, and the footage remains locked in official archives, accessible only to investigators with specific authorization. It was August 11, 2017, and the dry season had tightened its grip on Mozambique's Niassa province, a vast, sparsely populated region bordering Tanzania, where open woodland stretched for hundreds of miles with minimal human infrastructure. Celestino Abakar Mwenda, a 29-year-old equipment operator from the provincial capital, had been working at a large agricultural compound in the region for 8 months. Mwenda had taken the position to support his young family back in the capital, sending most of his earnings home each month. The compound consisted of prefabricated buildings connected by gravel paths and surrounded by a perimeter fence designed more for livestock management than predator exclusion. Mwenda operated heavy machinery during the day shift and lived in shared staff quarters on the eastern edge of the compound. He was well liked among the crew, known for keeping to himself during off hours and calling his wife most evenings from the operations building, where the phone signal was marginally stronger. The layout required workers on rotating schedules to walk several hundred yards between the residential block and the operations building, a route that crossed an open stretch of cleared ground with intermittent overhead lighting. The compound's management had been aware of lion activity in the surrounding area for weeks. Local communities had reported livestock kills within a few miles of the perimeter, and workers had observed fresh tracks along the fence line on multiple occasions. One crew member had reported finding a partially consumed carcass of a young cow less than half a mile from the compound's eastern boundary. The project's safety officer had issued a memorandum advising staff to avoid walking between buildings alone after dark, but enforcement was minimal, and the advisory was widely disregarded due to the frequency of night shift rotations. Several workers had raised concerns through informal channels, but no structural changes to lighting or fencing had been implemented. The general attitude among staff, according to later testimony, was that the lions were interested in livestock, not people. African lions are among the continent's most formidable predators, with adult males weighing between 330 and 500 pounds, and females, the pride's primary hunters, averaging 265 to 395 pounds. Lions possess exceptional night vision and are predominantly nocturnal hunters, conducting the majority of their kills between dusk and dawn. Their hunting strategy in open terrain relies on stalking to close range, typically under 30 yards, before launching an explosive charge that can reach speeds of 35 to 40 miles per hour in short bursts. The killing method involves dragging prey to the ground and applying a sustained bite to the throat or muzzle, suffocating the victim over several minutes. Lions in regions with reduced natural prey frequently turn to livestock and, in documented cases across Niassa and neighboring provinces, to humans. Lion-related fatalities across sub-Saharan Africa are estimated in the dozens to low hundreds annually, though figures vary significantly due to underreporting in remote areas. According to the provincial police investigation and statements from compound personnel, Mwenda left the operations building shortly after dark to walk back to the residential block at the end of his shift. He was alone. The route crossed approximately 200 yards of open ground with patchy lighting, several of the overhead fixtures along the path having failed weeks earlier without replacement. A basic security camera mounted on the operations building captured low-resolution footage of the path and a portion of the surrounding cleared area. Investigators reviewed the recording, which showed Mwenda's figure moving along the path before a second shape became visible at the edge of the frame, low, fast, and closing from the darkness beyond the light's reach. The footage quality was poor, the image grainy, and washed out by the building's exterior light, with no audio. The shape reached Mwenda's position, and both figures dropped from view almost simultaneously. The sequence lasted only seconds before the frame showed nothing but the empty, lit path. Workers in the residential block reported hearing sounds of disturbance from that direction, followed by silence. A search party found Mwenda's body approximately 60 yards off the gravel path, in the scrub beyond the cleared perimeter. The scene evidence was consistent with a large predator attack, specifically drag marks through the dirt beginning at the path's edge, bite trauma concentrated around the neck and upper body, and partial consumption. Lion tracks were confirmed around the scene. Investigators later identified a section of damaged fencing along the eastern perimeter, where the wire had sagged low enough for a large predator to pass beneath. Provincial police and the compound's internal investigation team secured the security camera's storage unit before the system's automatic overwrite cycle could erase the relevant footage. The recording was retained as part of an internal review and insurance assessment. The footage was never released publicly. Wildlife authorities and local wildlife scouts attempted to locate the responsible animal in the following weeks, but the operation was hampered by the vast terrain. It was August 22, 2016, outside Chiang Mai, Thailand, where humid afternoon heat settled over narrow forest trails, winding through a crowded wildlife tourism park. Wooden ride platforms creaked beneath moving tour groups, while handlers guided visitors through muddy downhill paths lined with bamboo, hanging vines, and dense tropical trees after heavy overnight rain. Carmen Villanueva was 41 years old and had just retired after nearly 20 years working as a restaurant chief in Arizona. Based on what I gathered, this Southeast Asia trip was supposed to be the reward she and her new husband kept delaying because life kept getting in the way. Bills, work schedules, aging parents, the usual stuff that most of us can relate to. So the dream vacation was pushed and eventually set aside. And when Carmen finally booked the ticket to Thailand, she was so excited about preparing for the elephant excursion. Her friends later said that she even spent weeks embroidering her own outfit, including the travel skirt decorated with stitched shells and small metal ornaments. Carmen wanted every photo from the trip to feel personal and memorable. Personally, reading that part stuck with me a little because it sounds exactly like something a thoughtful person would do without ever imagining it could become dangerous. Her husband later told investigators Carmen had been especially excited about the elephant ride. She loved animals, but like most tourists, her understanding of elephants mostly came from zoos, documentaries, and travel advertisements showing smiling families riding calmly through forests. The park itself looked organized and safe, without any major incidents reported. The elephant trail wound through humid jungle paths, with uneven downhill sections beneath low-hanging branches. Asian elephants can weigh over 8,000 pounds, but even trained elephants can gradually become distressed when pain or irritation builds over time. The elephant assigned to Carmen was a 34-year-old female named Baya. Handlers generally described her as reliable during tourist rides, though some staff later admitted she occasionally became irritable during longer downhill sections in hot weather. Before loading passengers, the senior mahout briefly noticed the small metal shell ornaments attached to Carmen's handmade skirt while helping her onto the wooden riding platform mounted on Baya's back. He adjusted part of the fabric away from the saddle edge before the ride started, believing it would not cause problems during the relatively short route. At first, the ride appeared completely normal. Carmen's husband walked alongside parts of the designated pedestrian trail, taking photographs while the elephants moved slowly through the forest. Carmen was even smiling happily in photos, while Baya navigated shallow slopes and muddy sections, but later investigators realized the situation had probably been building for several minutes before everything finally went wrong. As the ride continued down the uneven jungle trail, the wooden platform kept shifting slightly from side to side. Other riders later said Baya started looking more uncomfortable as they moved downhill. She kept flicking her ears, shaking her head, and stopping more often than usual. At first, the handlers thought she was just irritated by the heat because she was still listening to commands and staying on the trail. What nobody noticed at the time was that part of Carmen's handmade skirt had slowly slipped beneath the riding blanket during the ride. One of the small metal shell ornaments kept rubbing against the area beneath the saddle every time Baya stepped downhill. Witnesses later described Baya becoming visibly agitated before the attack fully began. The elephant started breathing harder, swinging her trunk repeatedly, and resisting directional commands from the mahout. At one point, the handler briefly stopped the group and attempted to reposition part of the riding blanket after noticing Baya shifting uncomfortably beneath the platform. But as the ride resumed down another uneven slope, the saddle platform shifted sharply sideways again. Baya suddenly released a loud distress cry and lurched violently off the trail path. Carmen lost her balance and was thrown from the platform hard enough for her head to strike an exposed tree root beside the trail, but the panic did not stop there. Still distressed and disoriented, Baya continued swinging the partially shifted platform against nearby trees while handlers shouted commands and attempted to calm her. One broken wooden support beam struck Carmen across the chest as she tried crawling away from the trail edge. Nearby elephants reportedly became agitated by the noise and shouting, making the situation even harder for handlers to control. The mahout eventually managed to position himself between Baya and Carmen while continuing verbal commands and pressure hook guidance. But during another abrupt movement, Baya stepped onto Carmen's lower torso before handlers finally regained enough control to move the elephant backward. Emergency crews reached the trail within 8 minutes and found Carmen barely conscious with catastrophic injuries. She was airlifted to a trauma center but died during surgery later that evening. Investigators later discovered Baya had suffered a severe harness injury years earlier after a poorly fitted riding saddle tore skin and tissue along her right flank near the ribs. Although the wound healed, Veterinary records reportedly noted the scar area remained highly sensitive to prolonged rubbing and pressure beneath riding blankets and saddle straps. Officials ultimately concluded the incident matched a progressive pain-induced distress response caused by repeated irritation against the old injury during the trail ride, rather than a sudden, unprovoked attack. It was November 19th, 2013, and the autumn light was fading across the terraced hillsides of a remote district in Nepal's western foothills. The forest edge lay less than 300 yards from the outermost village houses, a proximity that had become a source of mounting dread over the previous months. Sabitri Kunwar, a 38-year-old woman from the village, lived with her extended family in one of the houses closest to the forest. Kunwar worked the family's terraced fields and kept a small number of livestock in a stone-walled pen adjacent to the house. She was a quiet, steady presence in the village, known among neighbors for her early mornings and her refusal to leave the fields unattended, even as warnings about the leopard intensified throughout the district. A leopard had been operating in the district since at least early 2013. The district wildlife office had received multiple confirmed attacks on humans in surrounding villages since the beginning of the year, several of them fatal. The animal had displayed behavioral patterns consistent with an individual suspected of repeated attacks on humans, targeting solitary individuals near the forest margin during the low-light hours of dawn and dusk. Wildlife authorities had attempted to trap and track the animal on 2 occasions without success. Both efforts had involved cage traps baited and positioned along known approach routes near affected villages, but the leopard had avoided them entirely. Advisories had been issued to all villages in the affected area, warning residents to avoid the forest edge alone, particularly after mid-afternoon. Many residents, however, had no practical alternative. Daily tasks like collecting firewood, tending livestock, and working the lower terraces required proximity to the tree line. Historically documented man-eating leopards in Nepal and India have been responsible for double-digit confirmed attacks per individual animal, making them among the most persistent and dangerous wildlife threats to rural communities. On the afternoon of the incident, Kunwar had left the house to retrieve a goat that had wandered toward the lower terraces near the tree line. A neighbor, working on a terrace across the hillside roughly 100 yards away, was the only other person outdoors at the time. Leopards are among the most adaptable and elusive large predators on Earth, with adult males weighing between 130 and 175 pounds and females averaging 70 to 130 pounds. What they lack in size relative to tigers and lions, they compensate for with extraordinary stealth, agility, and ambush precision. Leopards are crepuscular hunters, most active during twilight, and their spotted coat provides near-perfect camouflage in dappled forest light and undergrowth. Their attack strategy relies on absolute concealment until they are within a single bound of their target, typically 5 to 10 yards. The killing bite targets the back of the neck or throat, and leopards are uniquely powerful relative to their size, capable of hauling prey heavier than themselves vertically into trees. In man-eating scenarios, leopards have demonstrated a consistent pattern of targeting solitary individuals in low-visibility conditions near forest margins. According to the district police investigation and witness testimony, the neighbor had been attempting to place a call and had the phone in hand when they observed Kunwar moving down the lower terrace toward the tree line. The neighbor noticed rapid movement from the undergrowth at the forest edge and instinctively pointed the phone toward the commotion, capturing a brief segment of distant, low-quality footage and partial audio from across the terraced hillside. The recording, reviewed later by investigators, showed a distant figure on the lower terrace, a rapid movement from the tree line, and an abrupt collapse. Audio captured a brief vocalization, followed by sounds of disturbance, then nothing. The leopard struck from concealment at the forest margin, closing the distance before Kunwar could react. Scene evidence documented by the response team indicated that the animal had targeted the neck from behind, consistent with leopard predation behavior. The force of the strike brought Kunwar to the ground, and the animal had begun to drag the victim toward the tree line, pulling her several yards across the terrace before the neighbor's shouts and the approach of other villagers from the houses above caused the animal to release its grip and retreat into the forest. Kunwar was reached within minutes by family members and neighbors. She had sustained catastrophic bite trauma to the neck and throat. Villagers carried her toward the nearest road, but the closest medical facility was hours away along steep mountain trails. She did not survive the journey. The district wildlife office launched an intensified effort to locate the animal in the following weeks. The neighbor's phone was retained by authorities as evidence during the ongoing investigation. The footage was not released publicly, a decision attributed to concerns about panic and vigilante retaliation against the broader leopard population in the surrounding forest. After initial attempts at live capture proved unsuccessful, the suspected man-eating leopard was eventually located and eliminated by a licensed hunter operating under wildlife authority.